Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. August 14, 2000 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, WCW Turmoil, Hall of Fame Candidates. More. By Dave Meltzer. The turmoil regarding the future of World Championship Wrestling continues with what apparently is a shakeup, leaving Brad Siegel backing Vince Russo in complete control of the company. At the same time, the losses continue to escalate, with July's losses estimated at $7 million, the most, by far, of any month in the history of a company now on track to lose close to $80 million over the course of this year. The main stories going around seem to involve the prospective merger of AOL and Time Warner, and getting the company's losses under control. Rumors are flying everywhere that the company is looking to dump most of the high-priced talent, although at press time nobody, with the exception of Roddy Piper, whose situation is up in the air due to legal reasons, has even been approached about either a buyout or being let go. Certainly Hulk Hogan, because of his huge salary and the fact Russo is opposed to bringing him back and there is a lawsuit regarding that situation out, is topping the list, which could include Diamond Dallas Page, who is ready to return and was scheduled to already be back, but at this point there seem to be no plans of bringing him back. Scott Hall, Lex Luger, Bill Goldberg, who many in the company have turned against because he doesn't get along with Russo, and Bret Hart, since there is no indication of when he would be able to return to action. There is belief that if the cuts would be made above the head of Siegel, that even Kevin Nash and Sting, who they want to protect, may not be safe. At the same time, all of the wrestlers involved are under contract for various lengths of time, Goldberg for 3 years, Hall and Nash for 1.5 years, Hart through the end of November, Page for about 2 years, Piper for 2 more pay-per-view matches, and Hogan through April, and getting rid of them at this point wouldn't save any significant money this year. But while virtually everyone in the company and those in the periphery have heard and discussed these rumors, aside from Piper, nothing directly has been said to anyone on the list. The only changes that can be confirmed are that approximately 17 undercard wrestlers, mostly in the $150,000 and below salary range, including Horace Hogan and Disorderly Conduct, have been let go. It is believed that virtually any wrestler of the undercard variety that gives problems will be let go. Eric Bischoff's position was officially changed to being a consultant, but he is still under contract and was scheduled later this week to go with Goldberg and Rick Steiner to the Sturgis rally. Bischoff is still in the wings attempting to get himself back in power, either if this administration fails, or attempting to get a group together to buy the company outright. Still, even if every single wrestler in the company worked for free, the company would still be on track to lose close to $40 million this year. The problem isn't so much the high salaries, although today that is a huge problem, but the lack of revenue to support those salaries. The same wrestlers were making by and large the same money, and the company had far more undercard wrestlers under contract 2 years ago when it made a tremendous profit. The problem is the ad revenue is way down, the PPVs have bottomed out, and the house show business has largely evaporated, as well as similar declines in merchandising and licensing. When those revenue streams were strong, the company could easily support the salary structure. Nevertheless, what happened, maybe not to the extent the declines happened, but still most of what happened through failing to elevate new talent, was predictable even when the company's profits were at its peak. Russo has a core of younger wrestlers who are loyal to him, and the morale is better than ever among that group, because he got rid of the people holding them back and are giving them a chance in the spotlight. Ticket sales, which would be the first sign of a turnaround, have not shown any improvement. A recent fan survey indicated by and large the current approach is not what the audience wants. While average attendance per show is up over 2 months ago, that is largely due to cutting house shows down to 3 per month, thus the average is swayed more by the Nitro and Thunders, which more money is spent advertising, and which are not profitable ventures due to the huge amount of money spent producing the shows, but draw larger paid attendances. And the numbers are well down from the levels the company was doing 10 months ago when Russo was first hired. Thunder ratings and the buy rates are up from the level during the Sullivan regime, but way down from the numbers Russo first inherited, and he has been at the creative helm 7 of the past 10 months. No doubt the 3-month period he wasn't at the helm, under Sullivan, can't be considered anything short of a disaster. Nitro averages roughly the same rating it did under Sullivan, although the most recent show on August 14th show drew a slightly lower rating than any show under Sullivan did. Russo, in what was clearly a rallying speech on Nitro, talked about not caring about ratings, which is a philosophy WCW needs to take because it may take time to build them, but they do need, financially, to care about the buy rates and the arena business at all stages, because arena business will show if a turnaround is coming or not immediately, long before ratings. But in attempting to downplay those factors, it's also a way to buy him time, so it's smart for him. The question is no longer how much time he can buy from Siegel, but how much time Time Warner is willing to let them have, because there is no way losses from a wrestling company are going to get in the way of one of the biggest corporate mergers in history come the end of the year. Where Russo came off badly in his interview was the challenging of John Rocker to a match at Starrcade at the Nassau Coliseum in December. Aside from the fact Starrcade is booked for the MCI Center in Washington, D.C., the Nassau Coliseum is booked for a pay-per-view in January 2001, although I suppose Russo could get that changed if the Coliseum is available on that date. For a guy who talked about me but we, it made no sense for him to try and build to the biggest pay-per-view of the year with himself as a hometown babyface getting a celebrity rub, instead of allowing one of his wrestlers that could be built around get it, similar to how it would have been better in the long run for a wrestler as opposed to Russo, even if Russo were to be involved peripherally, to have been the one to cut Ric Flair's hair. Russo, who at first said he wasn't going to be back on television just 3 weeks ago, basically hinted that wasn't the case, as he basically said he owed Flair a receipt. When Rocker was hot coming off the Sports Illustrated article, there was internal talk of trying to use him, but the belief is as a name-value celebrity, his drawing power has greatly diminished since that time. It is also questionable whether the Braves would allow it. From a front office standpoint, aside from Siegel, who seems to be 100% behind Russo, perhaps figuring him as the last-ditch hope of saving the company, opinions are a lot more mixed, as noted by the memo that went around in last week's issue. With one of the most controversial topics in the Observer every year, a Hall of Fame issue coming in 2 weeks and it already being past the balloting deadline, so these thoughts aren't going to influence any outcomes, it is that time where I run down the candidates and give my thoughts on them. When running down the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, you can see very strong representation from the 50s through the 80s. The 90s are underrepresented, although many of the stars from at least the latter part of the decade are still finishing their careers and may eventually be in. The period before 1950 is also underrepresented, but that's also somewhat understandable in a business that has very little history and few historians. Much of wrestling's history is comprised of hazy memories and media stories from the past that may or may not be accurate. We have roughly 40 members whose careers peaked in the 80s, and 45 in the 70s. Some men are counted twice, for example, Terry Funk, who was a superstar in both decades. We have nearly as many, 38, from the 60s. We have only 18 from the 90s. There are different ways of looking at that. Because of the death of territories, there are fewer wrestlers working full-time in the United States, and thus the percentage of full-time wrestlers voted in may not be all that different. However, if you throw in Japan, which only had one promotion for most of the 60s, 3 for most of the 70s, and had more than 36 by the late 90s, that sort of negates the argument. The 50s, which had so much live wrestling weekly in so many territories, are also somewhat underrepresented because of the nature of it being before so many people involved with this were even born. To take care of some of this, we are going to induct wrestlers, all of whom actually peaked in the 40s. This year not from the balloting, similar to the Veterans Committee in baseball, since it's virtually impossible for anyone pre-1970 to be voted in. There are enough people already in from the 60s through the 80s that probably nobody that deserving from that era hasn't been included. There are a few borderline guys who may or may not get voted in. As the years go by, with newer candidates coming in, their chances seem to decrease. Anyway, since it's becoming an annual tradition, here are my thoughts on who I did and didn't vote for. Some are people from last year that I felt should have gotten in and didn't. A few are people who, for various reasons, I've changed my mind on. Keep in mind, with 10 people in the category of performers as a max, and I went with 10, there are the people I felt were the obvious picks, and then there were the ones at the bottom where there were about 6 or 7 people for the final 3 slots. Here were the results of last year's balloting. A performer needed to be mentioned on 60% of the votes that include people from his respective region, either US and Canada, Japan, or Mexico, to be voted in. Everyone who received 10% to 59% are on the ballot this year, plus a number of newcomers being voted on for the first time, largely because they met the eligibility requirements, been active in wrestling for 15 years or past their 35th birthday. Last year, Jushin Liger, 95%, Linus Asuka, 71%, Keiji Muto, 69%, and Jim Ross, 67%, were all voted in. Those who were the closest last year to making it were Shinya Hashimoto, 58%, Shawn Michaels, 58%, Mick Foley, 55%, and Fabulous Moolah, 50%. Others in descending order, that qualified for the ballot again but received less than 50% of the vote last year were Bull Nakano, Carlos Colon, Dick Murdoch, Gran Hamada, Lizmark, Wahoo McDaniel, Cien Cars, Undertaker, Hiroshi, Ken Shamrock, Jimmy Snuka, Conan Lou Albano, Chavo Guerrero, Ole Anderson, Pedro Morales, Wilbur Snyder, Fulk Han, Michael Hayes, Eric Bischoff, Bob Backlund, Arn Anderson, Terry Gordy, Masahiro Chono, El Satanico, Gorilla Monsoon, and Seiji Sakaguchi. My thoughts in this year's candidates. Lou Albano. Albano is an interesting choice because people who grew up in the 70s WWF era will think he belongs, and virtually nobody else will. He was the top heel manager during the 70s, rotating top heels with Fred Blassie and the Grand Wizard, to oppose babyface champions Bruno Sammartino, Pedro Morales and Bob Backlund. He also almost always was put as the manager of the heel tag team champions. He, usually more than the tag team itself, were the heat and personality of the team. As mentioned last year, I didn't pick him because through audio tapes, I heard Albano's New York interviews at his peak. Later through video, saw his stuff from the early 80s before the face turn and WWF went national. He was no better than a lot of the heel managers in other territories that I saw. The only difference is he had the New York exposure. Arn Anderson, a very good worker and one of the best interviews ever. Very well respected among his peers. I don't see him as a strong Hall of Fame candidate, however. Gene and Ole Anderson, a change from last year was grouping Ole with Gene as a tag team as opposed to an individual. Ole routinely got votes in past elections, but was never a threat to make it. The Andersons were the top heel team for most of the 70s in the Carolinas. Since that regional belt became the NWA World Tag Team titles that went national through TBS, from a historical standpoint, their total period as World Tag Team champions is up there with Bruiser and Crusher, both of whom are in. Ole himself also was a booker and one of the best heel interviews ever. Ole was someone I considered, but it was a numbers game. As a team, the Andersons were really a Carolinas regional team and never big on a national basis. Steve Austin, to me, this is the #1 pick for this year, in his first year eligible. He's the biggest merchandise draw in the history of the business, or at least over a 2-year period of time. He's headlined some of the biggest money shows ever. He was the driving performer during the period where the WWF turned things around to become the hottest company of this era. He's a very good worker, was a huge draw and a great talker. Having said all that, there is one thing that sticks in my head about Austin. Realistically, Austin became a major star in late 1996. He was one of the top stars, but not the top star, in the WWF for most of 1997. He was the god of wrestling in 1998. But by November of 1999, he was out with his current injury that threatens his career. His real period as a title contender and the Stone Cold Superstar to teenagers mainstream and leading WWF to the promised land really hit big with the Mike Tyson angle, and he was gone less than 2 years later with his future in doubt. There is a longevity factor that many have brought up. In an internet test poll not among people sent ballots to, he fared remarkably badly. My thoughts in this election is he'd be a Willie Mays or Hank Aaron type pick, like Liger last year, almost unanimous. Still, Satoru Sayama is deservedly in, largely for a period from 1981-83. It isn't as if Austin was just a flash in the pan for 2 years, because he was one of the top guys in the business, just couldn't get his break during his WCW days. Bob Backlund. My thoughts on Bob Backlund changed this year when going through the history of wrestling at Madison Square Garden. My negatives on Backlund were always that he really wasn't a good worker and wasn't a good interview either. His plus in his 6-year run at the top of the WWF, one of the longest title runs ever. That was always negated to me to a degree by the fact he did little or note beforehand, and not all that much afterwards. He was a star in New Japan. But, of all the wrestlers that ever worked Madison Square Garden, which, like it or not, is the most famous wrestling arena in North America, he sold it out as many times as anyone. Because records aren't complete, Bruno Sammartino may have had 1 or 2 more, or 1 or 2 less, but the numbers are pretty equal. This isn't to say Backlund was overall as popular as Sammartino because Sammartino had the staying power on top that Backlund didn't have. But, even if Sammartino had a few more sellouts, he also headlined nearly twice as many shows to get it in. Anyone who can lay claim to a drawing card record ahead of virtually every major performer that worked the Garden has to be in based on that alone. Chris Benoit. This is an interesting pick. Nobody will question that inside the ring, he is better than 95% of the wrestlers already in. Nobody will also question that as far as being a main eventer and a big draw in many parts of the world, he's not that at all. Even though he's now in his 15th year in the business and is 33 years old, he is still considered by most as a young rising star. He's a better worker than Dynamite Kid, who is in largely because he was an awesome worker and also was never a singles main eventer outside Calgary. He's every bit as good, and at this point in his career quite a lot better, than his rival Jushin Liger, who went in easy. My feeling on Benoit, and it's the same reason I voted for Shawn Michaels, that if someone is that great a performer, even if they weren't a big draw, and Michaels obviously has more of a track record as a draw than Benoit, but I think Benoit was a far more consistent in-ring performer even if Michaels was more spectacular, they should be considered. One can make a strong case for Benoit in the ring as the best junior heavyweight in history. If you can be one of the top 5 workers on a consistent basis for more than a decade, and if you add up points for most outstanding wrestler in the annual polls for the 90s, Benoit comes only behind Kenta Kobashi, who isn't eligible but should be an automatic pick when he is. Mitsuharu Misawa, who is in, Liger, who went in with a record number of votes, and Manami Toyota, who also should be in as soon as she's eligible. That alone deserves inclusion. Because of the perception of him as being young, I don't know if he'll get many votes, as people are thinking of him as someone to be considered in 5 years, but he's got mine. Cien Caras, a top star in Mexico from the 70s to the present, largely because Mexico has had few true heavyweights. Not a great worker, and it's hard to really get it as to why he's been a star and a headliner for so long other than he made his name and has been a good draw for many years. But he doesn't make my list. Masahiro Chono. He was someone that I considered last year. Due to injuries, he's done nothing to help his cause since. A year ago I expected he'd be someone who would eventually make it. Now I'm very skeptical that will ever happen or even he'll ever be a serious candidate because from a physical standpoint, he really should retire. If it hadn't been for injuries, as he would have been a super draw with great charisma, he'd have made it for sure. Carlos Colon, a borderline pick. A very strong case can be made for him, being a great local draw dating back to the mid-70s, and he's still the biggest name in Puerto Rico today. Jerry Lawler and Jackie Fargo are in largely because they were great regional draws. The 2 main factors keeping him out are that he really was never that good inside the ring, and the Bruiser Brody issue that will always hang a cloud over his promotion and in many ways spelled the end of the glory days for himself and his company. Colon to me is a guy who got over, got power, and was kept strong on an island looking for a native hero to beat up big American superstars. I see him as similar to Moolah, except that Colon from the mid-70s to late 80s was a huge draw. Mick Foley, I voted for him last year. His credentials 1 year later are much stronger. His influence on the business, both good and bad, can't be overstated. He's one of the greatest promo men this business has ever seen. He, despite not being the greatest natural athlete, was involved in numerous legendary matches. Even physically broken down, he had one of the best matches of his career this year at the Royal Rumble, and his interviews leading to his retirement were classics. The retirement that didn't happen was a triumph of money over art, but it's not like it's anything every other wrestler in history practically didn't also do. Throw in a best-selling book and 10 Best Brawler awards, and with the exception of Austin, he's the strongest candidate on this year's list. Fabulous Freebirds, Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy have been solid candidates individually, but neither was ever going to get 60% of the vote on their own. In the case of Hayes, it was never Hayes the single wrestler that belonged, it was the Freebirds. Gordy established strong credentials in all Japan after leaving the Freebirds behind. Had it not been for the drug overdoses that killed his career, there's a good chance he would have already been in the Hall of Fame. As a unit, the guys were revolutionary, not so much for the introduction of the rock music to wrestling, but being a major part of popularizing it. They were also one of the most successful tag teams in the ring. Gordy was a great worker and Hayes had tremendous ability to get heat outside the ring. Longevity is the question here. They set records in the Mid-South, drew well in Atlanta, and set even more records in Texas. The Freebirds we're talking about were only 1979-86, but they were on top everywhere they went and popped territories. They beat the Andersons, who were near the top in keeping business steady. They also beat the Andersons in that they were on top in more different parts of the country. I didn't vote for them as individuals, but as a tag team, they make it. Chavo Guerrero, an excellent worker who came along at the wrong time. Because he was a small man in a business that wasn't going to push someone of that size, he never made it as big as he would have had he come along today. Still, he was a huge draw in Los Angeles as the first major rival of Roddy Piper, but he didn't have the staying power to make it as a legend. Years later, when Guerrero returned on AAA shows, the fans didn't treat him any different from any other prelim wrestler. He also had great matches in Japan as a rival of Tatsumi Fujinami and Atsushi Onita. His career also faded pretty quickly for a number of reasons. Someone to think about, but ultimately, no. Gran Hamada, I considered him very closely for one of the final spots. As a worker, he belongs in. You're talking about a guy who was a great worker for 28 years. He was one of Pero Aguayo's biggest rivals, in both Mexico and Japan. He also bridged the Satoru Sayama Jr. heavyweight era, the Jushin Liger era, and is still going strong as a very good worker just before his 50th birthday. Because of longevity, he's a much stronger candidate than Guerrero. However, Hamada was never a main eventer outside of Mexico and Japanese indie groups. He was a star, but never a true superstar. In Japan, it was Yoshihiro Asai, Ultimo Dragon, who popularized Lucha Libre, while Hamada was the strong worker that teamed with him but didn't have Asai's charisma. If several people make it this year, and next year is an easier year, I'd very much consider voting for him. Folk Han, the problem why Han will never make it, even though he probably deserves strong consideration for being so proficient at a revolutionary in-ring style and being the top foreign star in rings for nearly a decade, is because his matches were in rings. Then styles changed, and rings went to shoots, and Han's great submission skill fell out of favor because he's not a strong striker for a pure shoot, and it's very hard to be a world-class all-around fighter when you're pushing 40 and have only trained in one select aspect of fighting. The more I think about it and of his quality of matches, the more I think he probably belongs. Again, another guy to consider for next year. Owen Hart. Owen Hart was a very good wrestler, and when he wanted to be, an excellent one inside the ring. Interviews were so-so. Never a top draw. He did put Stampede Wrestling on the map internationally, something Bret, Dynamite and the rest could never do. He did get over huge in Japan originally and was well respected in Mexico and Europe. With the exception of Benoit and Liger, he's the only modern wrestler to be successful in all four major geographical regions. His death was the single biggest mainstream news story in the history of pro wrestling. And from all accounts, he was a really nice guy, much funnier outside the ring than he projected inside. The question goes like this. Had he retired last year, he'd have been a candidate, but not a serious one with a chance of making it. Newsworthiness plays a part in everything, as does timing. I didn't vote him in, largely because I thought if Han, who was more revolutionary in the ring, and Hamada, who had all the longevity and remained a great worker long past the age where someone who did so many years of Lucha Libre style should be, didn't make it, Hart shouldn't leap ahead of them. Hiroshi, I voted for him in the past and this year he squeaked in as my 10th pick. He was one of the top 5 workers in the business in his prime. As a booker, booked himself more unselfishly than any booker of the modern era. He didn't have the longevity as a top star because he got out of it full-time early to go into politics, whereas he's had a second successful career. My feeling is he should be in for the same reason Pat Patterson is in. Patterson was a great worker, although no better than, who later, because of his contributions to the WWF dynasty, made him a stronger candidate. Was Riki Choshu's assistant during a period when New Japan was clearly the #1 promotion in the world. Deserves credit for, but gimmick endings, jobbing cleanly to get many people over who were not in his league as far as either ability or charisma. His Olympic background and post-wrestling political success contributes to his all-around profile. Maybe because he was never the top man inside the ring in his promotion, he lacks on the superstar level even though in the ring he was as good, if not better than Muto, Chono or Hashimoto, as well as the longevity issue may keep him out. Shinya Hashimoto. Hashimoto has headlined 12 shows that have drawn more than 30,000 fans during his career, including many of the biggest live gates in history for matches against the likes of Naoya Ogawa, Nobuhiko Takada, Choshu, Chono, Kensuke Sasaki, and Muto. Only Hulk Hogan, with 13, has done more in the history of recorded wrestling. That alone, even if he was an average worker and didn't have many good matches, is enough to get him in. Throw in that he was the best world champion for New Japan during one of the hotter eras for any company in history, and that he had many awesome matches, and he's a no-brainer and probably the second or third strongest candidate on the list. His stock fell with some because he hardly wrestled this past year, always put Ogawa over. But he still headlined 3 more domes with the groundbreaking Ogawa feud, which was really the only super hot thing in the Japanese pro wrestling world over the past year. His match with Ogawa on April 7th drew the largest TV audience, 34 million at its peak, to watch a live wrestling match in many years. Akira Hokuto, as an overall worker in her prime, she was either the best or second best woman wrestler ever. She was the top star in her promotion during a period of time when the promotion was very strong. She was the biggest star on the biggest women's wrestling show of all time in 1995 at the Tokyo Dome. She came back from a broken neck, and was constantly battling all kinds of injuries while having some of the greatest matches ever seen. She didn't have the longevity. She's nothing special today even though she's still in her early 30s and has had a baby. But Japanese women don't have longevity for the most part. Remembering the matches and the heat she generated in her prime, she belongs in. The lack of staying power of her name and the fact her promotion faded quickly once she left hurts her chances. I'm not sure whether getting engaged to Kensuke Sasaki on their first date qualifies as A+ or a minus. Conan, very influential in Mexico. The longer he's out of Mexico, the less his chances are as it comes to being considered. His claim to fame is his drawing power in Mexico, which at its peak, was considerable. He also helped book AAA, which was arguably the hottest promotion around for a brief period in the mid-90s, and even did strong business for a few years in California. His influence was even stronger behind the scenes. People like Psicosis and Rey Mysterio Jr. would have never become major stars in Mexico, let alone ever made it to a major promotion in the United States, without him paving the way for them. Unless he returns to Mexico and sets business on fire again, I don't see him making it. And as long as the US pays 10 times better than Mexico, that isn't going to happen. Clearly he's not going to get a chance to make it to that level in this country. Lismark, one of the real revolutionary high flyers, who is still going strong well into his 40s. He's someone to think about. For me, there were stronger candidates. Mexico does seem underrepresented and he is a legend there and has been a main eventer for decades. Wahoo McDaniel was a headliner everywhere he worked until the tail end of his career. He was a star, almost always as a babyface, based on promoters liking to push him because he had some fame as a minor pro football star in the early days of the AFL playing in New York. He became well known because fans would chant his name in football, plus the natural heat Indian wrestlers, as Native Americans were known in those days, could get. Many people who worked territories with him, or lived in territories where he was the top star, have very high opinions of him as a draw. A borderline pick who I didn't vote for because of the numbers game. Shawn Michaels, this will always be the subject of major debates. People who grew up in the mid to late 90s and saw him as the greatest in-ring performer in the United States will think it's a travesty he isn't in already. People who view him for his constant excuses to never drop titles in the ring, and lack of professionalism outside, will just as vehemently argue he's lacking everything but the in-ring ability, and then can throw in the longevity issue and the fact he was never a super draw except for 2 quick runs. But his talent can't be denied. He's in, without much question. But he's not one of the top 4 or 5 picks either, like Austin, Foley or Hashimoto, where I can't possibly come up with a reason not to include him. His stock as a performer increased with a lot of people who grew up watching him because he was around when so many of the top performers of the era, some who were his equals or better, were working in Japan. Still, it seems like every young wrestling star we have on the IATA show at one point talks about Michaels as being either their inspiration or the greatest wrestler in the ring they ever saw. Gorilla Monsoon passed away this year, which might lead to some sympathy voting. He was a major player behind the scenes for Vince McMahon Sr. in getting the old WWF to become a very lucrative promotion in the regional days. Monsoon's fame was more because he had one of the great wrestling names, and was pushed on television as a wrestling legend for so long after his career ended, that the name endured, particularly in the first WWF boom period. But aside from the name itself, I don't see him as either candidate as an in-ring wrestler nor as an announcer. Fabulous Moolah, like Monsoon, she has a strong name since she's been around for 50 years. The Moolah arguments usually break down like this. She held the women's belt forever and was the biggest name woman wrestler in the United States for probably 25 years or more. The other side is, the belt meant nothing as a draw, she was never a headliner or a drawing card on her own. Her in-ring ability can't compare with any of the women already in as well as many who will never be in. I can't vote for Moolah ahead of Undertaker, or Dick Murdoch, or Carlos Colon, Wahoo McDaniel, Folk Han or Gran Hamada, none of whom made my list. Pedro Morales, a big star in the 70s and early 70s, whose sellout percentage at Madison Square Garden during his 1971-73 run as the WWF champion was better than any champion until the modern era of automatic sellouts no matter who is on top and what the lineup is. His career also went nowhere after leaving the WWF in early 1974 aside from the past his prime push when he returned as a legend in the early 80s. Modern fans probably have no idea how big a star he was during his 3 years on top, but he was also a heavily criticized champion, because he never could replace Bruno Sammartino in many fans' eyes. He was also not a great draw outside of New York, which is why they went back to Sammartino. His credentials are like Backlund's, limited to his success headlining Madison Square Garden. A difference is Morales was by reputation a great worker in the 60s in California, but by the time he hit it big in New York those days were over and his matches consisted of little but left hooks. He was simply a well-marketed ethnic star who drew big money, but only for 3 years and really only in one arena, and was never even used strongly in territories like California and the Carolinas after his period on top, despite his wrestling magazine superstardom. Backlund at least had 6 years in the position and drew better outside of New York, which makes him the stronger candidate of the two. Dick Murdoch, for whatever reason, mainly because I saw so much of his career when he was in the mood to have a great match, and when he was tremendous, I want to put him in. And he is a borderline pick. The reality is if he was always as good as he was on his good nights, he would already be in. And he was really bad on his bad nights. He was a star, but not the level of a star to make him an easy pick. As great as he sometimes was for as many years and as tough as he was, he's still the ultimate borderline pick, and this isn't the year that borderline guys are going to make it. Bull Nakano, my first thought when she became eligible last year was she was someone just below the level. But after reviewing her matches, she's a really strong candidate. She was a world champion women's wrestler in the United States, for whatever that is worth, but also in Mexico and in Japan. She was a main eventer for years. She was definitely the greatest working large woman in the history of the industry. Nobody even comes close. She had a great gimmick and played her gimmick to the hilt inside the ring. She carried many mediocre and below mediocre wrestlers to great matches. She had tremendous ring psychology and her matches generated incredible heat. Has to make my ballot. Rock and Roll Express as individuals, Ricky Morton was a great worker in his day. Robert Gibson was Ricky Morton's partner for a great run. They have to be given this before being dismissed. They were very popular in that teen idol role. Inside the ring they were a great working tag team in their heyday. When it comes to getting sympathy and ring psychology, Morton was one of the most underrated workers ever. Unfortunately, he had a gimmick that didn't work once he got old. They deserve a spot on the ballot and even some thought. But except in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, they were never really on top. They always had that great match third from the top in territories that did strong business, and they were a part, but never the main part, of the package. Boss Rutan, should a pancrase fighter be considered a pro wrestler? His record in shoots is very strong. Only a few losses early, all to big names, to Ken Shamrock, once to Frank Shamrock and once to Masakatsu Funaki. He never lost after March 10, 1995. Even if he did pick up some close decisions that he was lucky to have had go his way. He won the King of Pancrase title twice and the UFC heavyweight title once, and never lost there of them inside the battlefield as they were vacated. He probably never, at least as far as his own knowledge, participated in a worked match. His match with Masakatsu Funaki is legendary. As Pancrase strays even farther from its pro wrestling roots, pure Pancrase fighters seem to stray from consideration as maybe they would have gotten previously. Not this year. And unless the influence of Pancrase on pro wrestling increases greatly in Japan, he probably won't get strong consideration any year. Sabu, he didn't invent table breaking. But he popularized it. His influence on today's wrestling can't be denied. He also popularized doing death-defying stunts and matches filled with big moves with no thought of psychology. He was an indie star, but also never made it with a national organization, and once ECW had national exposure, he was long past his prime. An argument can be made for influence, and he certainly worked hard enough, and maybe too hard, and had incredible guts. I don't see him as a Hall of Famer, though. Seiji Sakaguchi, a big star in New Japan who was later president of the company during a big business run. He was a main eventer, largely as the number 2 guy in New Japan behind Antonio Inoki, for many years while wrestling was on network primetime, so his name in the culture is very big. Unlike his counterpart at the time, Jumbo Tsuruta, he was not a great worker. His best qualifications were behind the scenes in getting and keeping TV deals. Doesn't make my list. El Satanico, the man who has held more championships than any man in the history of Mexican wrestling. He was a good worker in his day, and still was well into his 40s. He's still a star today just before his 51st birthday. Maybe a stronger candidate than Cien Caras, but he's more of a guy who was very good for a long period of time, like a wrestler in the 70s who picked up a lot of regional titles, and was a star everywhere and made the babyfaces he took on shine, but never a guy who popped territories or made a name like Mil Mascaras or Pero Aguayo. Maybe a Mexican equivalent to Arn Anderson, except without the career-ending injury and thus hanging around in the same spot for another 12 years. Ken Shamrock, like last year, a very interesting pick. If you consider just work pro wrestling matches, absolutely not. If you consider a pro wrestler who became a martial arts superstar, maybe. If you consider Pancrase as pro wrestling, which, when he was there, what it was considered, his Pancrase record shows he's someone to think about. He was a pioneer of the MMA game in both Japan and the United States, and one of its earliest superstars. He also trained many successful fighters, and his influence did change what people perceive a real fight to look like. I picked him last year, but as shooting style gets less popular in the United States, his significance historically also diminishes. I shied away from him this year, but depending on what he does and the climate over the next year, that could change my mind. Jimmy Snuka, time is starting to run out for him because as new candidates become eligible, people forget. I considered Snuka, who I voted for 2 years ago, along with Undertaker and for the final pick. Undertaker was the biggest star internationally and drew bigger gates. Snuka and were better workers. Snuka was very revolutionary in the beginning of the change of the WWF from a pure size and power game to more high-flying. Although it was only a few years, people forget just what a huge star he was in the WWF in his day. He also worked on top in virtually every territory including Japan, where he was Bruiser Brody's tag team partner in both All Japan and New Japan, from the early 70s until when age and his personal demons finally caught up with him. Wilbur Snyder, I only saw him at the end of his career. He's very well thought of and is probably the strongest candidate from the late 50s and 60s that isn't already in. He was always a well thought of star, but he was never really a national legend either. Undertaker, I really believe he belongs in and is a bigger star than many I picked this year. He was part of huge money programs and the gimmick is along the most successful in wrestling history. It came down to he was the better worker. Undertaker, the bigger star, earned points for putting so many people over and making so many new stars and for being in a period where so many people were being made stars and keeping egos in check with everyone doing jobs. As mentioned last year, Bobo Brazil, Crusher and Bruiser are all in. None were as big a star as Undertaker and none were as good inside the ring as he was either. Even Undertaker of today is far more athletic in the ring than those three were at the tail end of their careers. We also had a category for non-wrestlers, similar to baseball. The standards 60% of the vote for inclusion are the same, but they don't count against the 10-pick maximum for the wrestlers. The category is largely for promoters, front office people and television announcers. Eric Bischoff did turn around a company that was a big money loser, but also turned it back around a few years later. To me, a promoter needs longevity. Right now, no. Even if things were strong, it may still be too early to put him in. Many guys have had quick runs on top. He absolutely was a revolutionary figure in the business and you can't underestimate the influence the Raw vs. Nitro war had on the rebound of wrestling in this country, and even worldwide. For influence, he belongs. But a promoter also has to be successful in running a profitable territory over the long haul. Jesse Ventura, forget about Ventura the wrestler. He was a great talker. He was not nearly the draw his legend states he was, but he did get good heat on interviews. Ventura was a monumental figure in the broadcast booth with Vince McMahon in the 80s WWF. He was one of the biggest mainstream names in wrestling during that period. He parlayed wrestling into broadcasting and then politics and is now a bigger figure on a national basis than anyone in the wrestling world, at least in the real world. Should a wrestling star being elected governor help his cause? Without the election, he wouldn't be considered? My feeling is because of its influence and how the press looked at wrestlers and wrestling and the changes it has brought about, combined with the fact that to this day we still have heel commentators, his name and influence are there. Even though Roddy Piper did the heel color to big ratings first nationally in 1981, it was Ventura who made it something everyone copied on their shows, and is a role that has continued as a staple of wrestling 15 years later. The pro wrestling landscape in Japan changed greatly over the past week with New Japan getting into the pay-per-view business on July 30th and the debut of the Pro Wrestling Noah promotion on August 5th. While smaller promotions, as well as both WCW and ECW, have run their pay-per-view events in Japan with limited results, the merging of the Japanese version of DirecTV with Sky Perfect TV led to the total universe hitting 2.2 million. The May 1st Pride show featuring the one-night tournament and the legendary Hoist Gracie vs. Kazushi Sakuraba match holds the record, drawing 48,000 buys, 2.2 buy rate, which is still less than the lowest American PPVs, which have a universe of 40 million homes, but is a lot more than the 3,000 to 5,000 the smaller wrestling groups had drawn even last year. Early estimates are the July 30th Riki Choshu vs Atsushi Onita match from the Yokohama Arena drew in excess of 40,000 buys, roughly a 1.8% buy rate, putting it in second place on the all-time list. Sky Perfect TV predictions are that the second New Japan pay-per-view on October 9th from the Tokyo Dome will hit 70,000 buys. Noah, which debuted on August 5th at the small home base of Differ Ariake, has that show airing on a tape-delayed pay-per-view on August 12th, and the August 6th show on August 19th. The target buys for this tape show, which will be priced at just $10, is 10,000 buys, which if they hit the target number, Noah will start getting regular live pay-per-view events in September. While it will be years before pay-per-view becomes the huge economic factor it became in the US, changing the entire economics of the industry, as pay-per-view in Japan is roughly 14 years behind the United States as it pertains to the number of homes hooked up. This is the first step in it happening. The Noah show was a huge success as an event, as fans sensed the debut show would eventually be looked upon as an historical event in Japanese mat history, the biggest chance for a new company to become a full-time major league promotion since the debut shows of All Japan and New Japan in 1972. Tickets for both shows sold out in minutes. The event itself wasn't profitable, since tickets were scaled far too inexpensively, leading to incredible scalper demand at the event. The promotion itself spent $100,000, which was more than the live gate of the first show, for a giant screen set up in the parking lot to handle some of the overflow, as another 1,300 fans were watching outside the building along with the 1,800 selling out the building. Scalper business outside the building was said to be the craziest in the history of Japanese wrestling, as the $60 ringside seats were going for $2,700 and just to get a standing room ticket in the building was going for $800 and all merchandise was sold out. Inside the ring, the idea was to merge All Japan style and ring wrestling with more storylines to create a modern product. Just as New Japan's debut show became legendary for decades for Karl Gotch pinning Antonio Inoki, the attempt was to make these shows legendary for the two nights where Jun Akiyama cleanly beat Mitsuharu Misawa, Akira Taue and Kenta Kobashi. The first night's main event was a 2-of-3 fall tag team match with Kobashi and Akiyama versus Misawa and Taue, with the stipulation that the winning team would then face each other the next night in a singles match. In one of many shockers, Akiyama made Misawa submit in the first fall in just 2 minutes using a front guillotine, a submission move that has been effective in the past in UFC. Ken Shamrock used it to beat Dan Severn in 1995, and was an old-time hooker's submission in the old days of wrestling and in the gyms when wrestlers would test each other, but hasn't been used as a pro wrestling finish in decades. In the second fall, which lasted 17:45, Akiyama did 2 knee drops and an exploder suplex to pin Taue, winning for his team in 2 straight falls. Kobashi, coming off double knee surgery, was said to have looked far better than expected, but the storyline was that Misawa and Taue, out of respect to him, stayed away from touching his knees. They also did a post-match angle for the next night, where when Akiyama held up Kobashi's hand after the match, Akiyama then turned on Kobashi and laid him out with a back suplex. The next night in the singles match, Akiyama pinned Kobashi, who was the last Triple Crown champion of All Japan before the split, in 24-25. Unlike Misawa and Taue, Akiyama spent the entire match attacking Kobashi's knees. Kobashi came back with a powerbomb on the floor, but Akiyama took over working the knees and giving him an exploder and locking him in the front guillotine. After the ref stopped the match, Kobashi was laid out on the mat for 2 minutes, putting over the power of the new move and trying to get Akiyama over as a new superstar, as they set the stage for a Misawa vs. Akiyama singles match. Just before All Japan split, Misawa booked Akiyama to beat him in a high-profile match at Budokan Hall. Other results of the August 5th show saw: 1. Takeshi Morishima pinned Makoto Hashi in 14:05 by debuting a new finisher, a combination choke slam and face crusher. 2. Tsuyoshi Kikuchi and Jun Izumida and Haruka Aigen beat Takeshi Rikyo and Mitsuo Momota and Rusher Kimura in 13:08 when Izumida pinned Rikyo with the Ace Crusher, so apparently Izumida is getting the move with Ace not being involved with Japanese wrestling. 3. Masamichi Marufuji and Kentaro Shiga beat Yoshinobu Kanemaru and Masao Inoue in 19:30. What was interesting about this match storyline was that Kanemaru and Inoue are the Woo FMW promotion tag team champions, having scored 2 wins over Gedo and Jado on FMW shows, and brought the belts to the ring. But going back to their home promotion with the belts, they immediately lost, which is to set up something with FMW. Shiga made Kanemaru submit with an armbar for the finish in a match said to be disappointing. 4. Yoshinari Ogawa and Masahito Kakihara and Daisuke Ikeda beat Yoshihiro Takayama and Takawa Mori and Satoru Asako in 23:46. Kakihara and Asako were both returning after being out for several months with injuries. Asako and Takayama and Amori are being put together as a new group, with bleached blonde hair, white ring outfits and white shoes. Kakihara was given a UFC style, which makes sense because he was a star with the old UWFI before joining All Japan. He attacked Amori right away with stiff blows, busting open his nose. Most of the match had another storyline, where Kakihara and Ogawa would each cooperate with Ikeda, but never with each other, as they used this match to start a singles feud. After the match ended, when Kakihara using an armbar submission Asako, Kakihara walked away by himself. 5. Akiyama and Kobashi won 2 straight from Misawa and Taue. New Japan's first pay-per-view show was very primitive by American standards, more similar to the early Jim Crockett pay-per-views of the late 80s. The show consisted of 7 matches, very primitive video features leading into the matches. They shot no major angles, and many of the biggest stars in the company weren't even on the show. None of the matches were great. Really none, even the main event, were that bad. The negative to the show was the crowd at the Yokohama Arena, while lucrative from a live business aspect, was dead most of the show. Most of the undercard matches were well worked, but they didn't seem very exciting because of the lack of crowd reaction. From a US standpoint, for match quality, this was probably a thumbs in the middle to slight thumbs up show, but overall would probably get mainly thumbs downs just because of the lack of heat. The crowd of 18,000 fans paid $1.5 million. Another $800,000 was grossed on pay-per-view. Rent for the building was $100,000 and Onita's payoff for the show was $100,000. The show had an opening that would never take place on a US show. The show was built around the Legends match with Choshu vs. Onita, an amazing one-sided slaughter. As they went backstage, as they would in the US, to Onita backstage before the match getting ready, they showed, on TV, a doctor shooting his knee up with 2 shots of painkillers, so he could get in the ring. 1. Shinya Makabe beating Hiroshi Tanahashi was a very solidly worked 70s style match. Tanahashi, a rookie, clearly has a ton of potential and a great look. He's a little green. Makabe, who has only been wrestling for 2 years, has already turned into a good worker and just started getting a push as a junior heavyweight powerhouse type. 2 stars. 2. Minoru Tanaka beating Akira was a real good athletic match which started hot. It slowed somewhat in the middle and was hurt by the lack of heat, with Tanaka getting an armbar after getting his knees up when Akira went for a splash. 2 3/4 stars. 3. Junji Hirata pinned rookie Kenzo Suzuki with the old machine suplex. Better match than you'd figure. Suzuki is very green, but has improved in the past 2 months. 3/4 star. 4. Shiro Koshinaka pinned Koji Kanemoto with a German suplex. This was a heavyweight versus junior match and Koshinaka wasn't selling much, which hurt the idea of this match as competitive. Great start. They built a good match since Koshinaka finally sold and Kanemoto got several near falls on him. Probably with a hotter crowd it would have seemed like a great match. Kanemoto got near falls after a moonsault and a Northern Lights suplex. Koshinaka hit a powerbomb and went for a second one, but Kanemoto got an armbar off it. 3 stars. 5. Takashi Iizuka beat Shinjiro Otani with a Uranage and choke. This was okay, but again marred by lack of heat. It's probably impossible for Otani to have a bad match, but this was as close as it gets. 2 1/4 stars. 6. Kensuke Sasaki and Yuji Nagata beat Manabu Nakanishi and Yutaka Yoshi in the longest match and best match on the show. Yoshi attacked Nakanishi, his partner, right away. Nagata was great. He's probably one of the best workers in the world right now. Nakanishi and Sasaki worked great power spots beating the hell out of each other. Yoshi got his reverse figure 4 on Sasaki for a rope break. Nagata weakened Yoshi's legs with the Nagata lock, and then Sasaki destroyed him with a lariat and Nagata got the pin with a bridging back suplex. 3 1/2 stars. 7. Choshu destroyed Onita. Choshu came out holding a photo of Masakazu Fukuda, who passed away earlier this year. Onita was pelted with garbage when he came out. He can't wrestle a lick, but he's a fantastic heel. Choshu of course tore the house down when he came out. Choshu looked in better shape than one would think. This match was very symbolic of the idea that New Japan, the real athletes, are totally out of the league of the garbage wrestlers, as he threw Onita around like a rag doll and gave him nothing. Onita was thrown several times into the barbed wire. Choshu, coming out wearing nothing but trunks, thus came off as unconcerned about the gimmickry of the explosive barbed wire. They killed the gimmick when it faces wrestling with the spot where Choshu had Onita in the Scorpion, and Onita grabbed the barbed wire, thus getting the explosion on his hand, which had the visual. But he'd rather take that than the pain from the real wrestling. From a New Japan's superior standpoint, this couldn't have been booked better. And it was a zillion times better than Onita's fiascos with Great Muta and Masahiro Chono because Choshu wouldn't let him do anything. Choshu finally gave him 4 lariats and the Scorpion Deathlock in the middle. Fans seemed disappointed with a groan when the bell rang, since it was the most one-sided main event I've probably ever seen on a major show, but did pop huge after the match when the music played. 1/2 star. In what was probably the most important mainstream article on pro wrestling in a long time, the Austin, Texas American Statesman ran its lead page 1 story on August 6th by John Marr called Ring of Death. Marr also ran a lead sports page story on August 7th about the death of Duncombe Jr., who played football at the University of Texas before going into wrestling, the same business his father was a star in. The first story talked about the current scene in pro wrestling with the frequent injuries and all too frequent deaths. Built around the death of Duncombe Jr., the story was built around Rob Van Dam, who has had 3 good friends, Duncombe, Gary Albright and Lou Mucciolo, Tucoli, pass away in the past 2 years. Marr wrote that pro wrestling might not be real, but it's as serious as a heart attack or a drug overdose. Marr noted that of the 24 pro wrestler deaths in recent years, many can be linked to the physical demands and the lack of protection, noting that wrestlers are both actors and athletes, but receive none of the safeguards afforded either profession. Marr noted the few deaths in sports of similar profile over the past year, Derek Thomas in the NFL and Bobby Phills and Malik Sealy in the NBA, all from auto accidents, were given huge media play and were considered shocking events within those professions, noting that, in a quote from myself, the reaction of the pro wrestling community to Duncombe's death was not even like it was considered a major news item because deaths happen so frequently. The week of Duncombe's death, there were 5 wrestler deaths alone, 3 of active wrestlers, and 2 of retired major stars. Michelle Duncombe, the wife of Bobby, who passed away from an overdose of painkillers, talked about Owen Hart's death, stating, "We talked about that stunt. Bobby said he would have done it. If you don't, they'll find someone who will." There was a comment from a Bret Hart Calgary Sun article stating, 14 months later, nothing in wrestling has changed. The sad truth is that the indifference was predictable. It also talked about the death of 400-pound steroid monster Jeep Swenson, who probably should be categorized more as an actor than a wrestler, although he did headline the infamous 1996 WCW Uncensored pay-per-view 1 year before his death and had a significant health scare 1 week before getting into the ring for that match. He did wrestle regularly in the 80s in Texas. It quoted his wife, Erin Swenson, as saying about his death, "His lungs failed. His liver failed. His kidneys failed, and then his heart failed and he was dead. He hated steroids and what they had done to him. He really wanted to be a small man again, to be free of the weight and the muscle." Melanie Pillman King talked about the death of Brian, saying, "It all started when Brian started taking human growth hormone. You can't directly attribute Brian's death to it, but that's what it was. I know it." Although Brian was on extensive pain medications due to his various injuries, the most serious, however, being obtained in a car crash, his death was diagnosed as sudden heart failure. There were probably a myriad combination of reasons that Brian died, and I admit that wrestling's pitfalls seem to be getting even greater as the business pushes the envelope to become more popular. It had a quote from myself saying, "There were occasional deaths, usually heart attacks, in the 1970s, guys who were in their 40s and 50s. There were some drug deaths in the mid-1980s. Nearly every name guy back then was on steroids. But the deaths have really picked up. It's a harder business, more physical. There's more big bumps. Injury rates have never been higher. People want to be noticed. And spectacular falls get people noticed. Matches are shorter, but you're doing 3 times as much in your 10 minutes as the older guys did in their 20 minutes. It noted Hulk Hogan complaining about wrestlers for not getting back into action soon enough after injuries, but then noted how they often come back early is an even bigger problem. A lot start taking pills to deal with the pain, said Van Dam, who admitted he began experimenting with them while wrestling in Japan. It starts out as a nice buzz. Pretty soon, you're taking more doses. I was trying to convince others this was helping me heal. I hear the same excuses now from pillheads. When talking about Mucciolo, Van Dam said, "I had to try to carry him when he passed out. It was many, many times, and we're talking a big, heavy wrestler. Muscle relaxers put you out in your dead weight. I'd been in the airport with Louis and I couldn't carry him to his flight and still make mine. He would come to work late, and he'd say it was because they carried him off the airplane and had to pump his stomach. We definitely knew it was a problem. Louis was like that all the time I knew him. I'd been in his shoes a few times before I learned the lesson. I've woken up in another state and wondered how I got there. Mauro Di Pasquale, who now lives in Austin, Texas, headed the WWF drug program from 1992 until it was for all real purposes dropped in 1996, and gave some very interesting thoughts about what it was and why it isn't there anymore. They wanted someone to clean up wrestling's act, he noted. This came after a major media outcry against the WWF coming after the trial of Dr. George Zarian III, who distributed steroids to WWF wrestlers including both Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan, both through the mail and at regular tour spots in Pennsylvania, and eventually spent several years in prison after being convicted of such. I set up testing like the International Olympic Committee. Actually, it was better than the IOC. I did hormone profiles. Initially, there was a fairly high amount of positives. It should be noted there were some, but not many suspensions during that period, and that Dr. Jonathan Daly, who headed the program before Di Pasquale took over, claimed in an early 1992 statement to the media that his testing showed no current usage by WWF performers. But they settled into it. We were pretty strict. Di Pasquale said there were wrestlers fired from the company for being unwilling to get off steroids, and that the wrestlers lost some hardness and put on some body fat. He blamed the death of the program on the fact WCW didn't follow the WWF's lead when it came to steroids. The WCW wrestlers thus had better bodies, and the WWF was losing fans at the same time. He said that the WWF was costing itself at both ends economically in doing serious drug testing. It was both the costs of the testing, which ran well into the mid to high six figures per year in a company which at the time was losing several million annually, but also hurting income on the other end because they weren't presenting the wrestlers with the kind of look the audience wanted. Di Pasquale now feels any drug program in wrestling is doomed. Drug use is really entrenched. Wrestling is entertainment, and the entertainment stems from these overly macho physiques. Wrestling is based on these huge guys going through their soap opera. Since a similar article in the New York Daily News a few months back, WCW has talked about having a substance abuse education program headed by Andy Tucker, a physician with the Baltimore Ravens. Van Dam and Wade Keller said they believe things are improving in wrestling when it comes to steroids. They're smarter about using steroids, Keller said. It's as illegal as it has ever been. Human growth hormone is not used as much. You need so much more than muscle to connect with fans. There was a time where they'd hire you if you looked like Mr. Universe. Things have changed since the 80s in that simply having a huge physique but little in-ring ability can't automatically make one a superstar, like it did Nikita Koloff, or get one a job with little or no charisma, like it did Warlord. If you have superlative in-ring ability and weigh 200 pounds or less, you can now get a reasonable spot in both WWF and WCW. Eddie Guerrero, which wasn't the case 10 years ago, when a 230-pounder with similar ability, Owen Hart, was considered too small to get out of the prelim ranks. There is more knowledge about steroids, and in a sense knowledge of how to use the drugs safer than 15 years ago, but at the same time, since the drugs are illegal, and usually not prescribed by doctors, there are less safeguards as to what it is one is actually purchasing. While things have changed for the better as far as the product inside the ring, I disagree they've gotten better because the pressure, both internally and externally, is there for spots, and the competition for the few big money spots is higher than ever because there are far fewer steady jobs than in the 80s available. Anyone who has closely followed the indie scene can tell a story about someone with great talent that the big promotions wouldn't give the time of day to, and then they gas themselves up. And whether they made it or not, some do, some don't, they suddenly get the time of day. This is the institutionalized part of it. Look, by and large, what the guys look like on top. Someone who wants to be a wrestler badly enough is naturally going to ask, how can I look like that? And few are naive enough not to figure out the answer. Most of the wrestlers in the 200-pound and under range, not all, are simply smaller, more talented guys than were allowed in before, who either cycle or heavily use steroids because even the small bodies in most cases need to look extra hard to get a shot, besides have outrageous athletic ability. Growth hormone usage is actually far more prevalent now than in the 80s. In fact, if you watch a tape of the guys in the 80s and the guys of today, you'll see overall the guys of today are far more muscular, which indicates a combination of the outside help being greater and to a lesser extent the current schedule being easier. And more of the guys from the early 90s that are still around today, in most cases their physiques are as if not far more impressive, Steiner, Luger, Savage, even though they are 10 years older, and that doesn't happen to people in real life. The most telling thing is not at the top, but in what you have to do to get in. Look at the wrestlers WCW has debuted on television over the past few months. Are they good workers? Or are they guys with good physiques? Take two great workers inside the ring who has never used steroids. Take two huge steroid freaks who have trained for 4 weeks and can barely walk in the ring. Send two to the Ultimate Pro Wrestling Camp, where the WWF has signed up so many developmental guys. Send the other two to the power plant. If there are 2 contracts available, the guys off steroids have a tremendous disadvantage in getting them. In WWF, and probably WCW as well, unless the guys off steroids have a great athletic credential, they'll also be at a great disadvantage. In WWF, the guys will be told to get off steroids when they sign, but the physique is still a great advantage at getting noticed and getting their foot in the door. Michelle Duncombe stated she believes the problems with steroids are also entrenched. It's a crazy mentality. Every single one of them has the same mentality. Even football players are not like this. It's part of the culture. Wrestling draws the type of people who are more prone to that. The every single one isn't fair, as wrestlers come from very different backgrounds and are very different people. Wrestlers are not all druggies. Some are amazingly clean when you consider the physical abuse they go through, but enough aren't to where problems crop up regularly. In the second story, Michelle Duncombe noted that in the 6 years the two were married, Bobby had 15 or 16 different operations. At one point he was having an operation every 6 weeks. He was torn between his love of the job and the pain. Marr didn't blame Duncombe's problems just on his wrestling, coming to the conclusions that it was football, wrestling and painkillers that was the deadly combination. His wife, who met him as a cheerleader for the Dallas Texans of the Arena Football League where Duncombe played in 1993 and 1994, even noted that arena football was 10 times harder than the wrestling. King said, "I will say that it is a huge problem in the industry that needed to be addressed a long time ago, as several more wrestlers have died and left behind wives and children as a result of the inability of the issue to be corrected. If the powers that be, whomever they are, do not step in and regulate wrestling to some extent, I do not see a light at the end of this long, dark tunnel that currently surrounds pro wrestling except maybe that of an oncoming train." The Missouri Court of Appeals on August 2 ruled in favor of Hart family attorneys Gary and Anita Robb in the controversy regarding using the documents signed by 5 of the children as part of the case. Judge Edwin Smith extended a temporary order sealing the documents, which the Robbs claimed were stolen and then given to WWF attorneys, in a story in the August 3 Kansas City Star that presented the WWF attorneys in the negative light as opposed to the earlier story. Gary Robb claimed the order expressly rejects the WWF's bold accusation of witness tampering by the Hart family lawyers, saying the judge would not have issued the ruling in his favor had there been any evidence of wrongdoing. Robb said the attorneys for Hart were contemplating filing a defamation lawsuit against the WWF attorneys, as well as exploring possible criminal and ethical violations. Jerry McDevitt responded to the charges in the story by Paul Wentz, stating, "Good. Bring 'em on. We didn't draft those documents. We didn't make those kind of allocations. I've been practicing law for more than 20 years and I've never seen anything like it. Never." McDevitt didn't act as though the ruling was a defeat, saying it was only a temporary ruling pending a full hearing. McDevitt called the term stolen documents fanciful thinking on their part. Smith in his ruling said he would later consider making his ruling permanent. Earlier, trial judge Douglas Long Jr. had unsealed the documents. Robb claimed McDevitt acted unethically because one of the Hart sisters, Ellie, wife of Jim Neidhart, a current WWF contracted employee whose technical job with the company at this point is to scout talent in Western Canada, obtained a copy of the documents and sent it to McDevitt. The WWF attorneys claimed the Robbs made the agreement public by mailing it to several members of the family. The Robbs countered, saying the legal rules of professional conduct require lawyers who receive confidential information from the other side to return those documents if they have any reason to suspect they were obtained wrongfully. McDevitt's conduct was criticized by Francis Hanna, a law professor at the University of Missouri at Kansas City, who is also working as a consultant to the Robbs on the Hart case. The attorney should read no further than to determine that it's confidential and notify opposing counsel immediately. If you got this by unethical means, you stop right there. Hanna said the allocation agreement was very common in estate law. The Robbs said they have no intention of calling the Hart family members who signed the agreement as witnesses in the trial. He said the agreement was simply to encourage the family to stick together and to fend off WWF officials, who they contend were trying to influence family members. The WWF has filed a motion with the Court of Appeals claiming the Robbs have used a tactic of trying to seal documents to manipulate the legal system, claiming they had entered into an agreement in question with witnesses in an attempt to buy favorable testimony. What was described as a very emotional funeral service was held for Gordon Solie on August 5 in Tampa. The eulogy was delivered by Tampa Tribune sports columnist Tom McEwen, a friend of Solie's and a Tampa institution for 4 decades. Also speaking at the ceremony included Brian Blair, reading a statement Solie had prepared on August 3 for the wrestling world, just 2 days before his death, as well as baseball superstar Wade Boggs, who grew up as a huge fan of Solie's and talked about him being the last person ever to get Solie's autograph when they went to lunch 2 weeks earlier. The WWF also sent videotaped tributes by Dean Malenko, Pat Patterson, and Jim Ross. McEwen talked about Solie outside of wrestling and said he should have been in more than just a Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, but also the Benson and Hedges and the Vodka Hall of Fames. Boggs, who was from the Tampa area, stated when Solie signed the autograph for him he signed it to an American hero. Boggs said that it was Solie, and not him, who was a real American hero, and said he was as nervous when he finally got to meet Solie as he was the first time he stepped foot in the batter's box in the major leagues. His son Eric also put together a video comprised of photos of Solie. Solie had been working just before his death on his final statement to the wrestling world after the word got out that he was dying of cancer. His family asked Blair to read it at the funeral. There are times when words cannot properly define one's thoughts or emotions. With all that has happened in my life over the past several months, this is certainly one of those times. First and foremost, I want to thank those of you who have passed along your well wishes. They are deeply appreciated. And considering the reason I have decided to deliver this statement, it is quite comforting to know during my final days here that I have had such a positive effect on so many of you. With that said, I also want to thank each of you for allowing me to be a small part of your lives, even if it might have been for just a few hours each week. And I want to thank you for allowing me to tell you a story that I never got tired of. A story that could be told 10,000 times, a story that could have a different ending each and every time it was told. To be quite honest, when my wife Smokey passed away more than 2 years ago, it could have been very easy for me to throw in the towel. But that wasn't me. Then the throat cancer came, and again it could have been very easy to give up. But again, that wasn't me. The bottom line is that I've never been a quitter. As a matter of fact, at one point I thought I had this damn disease beat. Obviously I didn't. While only the good Lord knows how much time I actually have left here, in my final days, I ask that you not grieve for me, but rather remember me fondly as you would an old friend. In my eyes, I lived a full and satisfying life that some only dream of fulfilling. Over the years I've had my share of heat with some people. How insignificant all that seems today. So being reflective, I hold no grudges and I have no ill will toward anyone. Let bygones be bygones. Well, I suppose there's not much more to say here except for a line that I once made famous and is now more appropriate than ever. So long, for the Sunshine State. Peace to all. Gordon. Among those at the funeral included Jack and Gerald Briscoe, Bobby Heenan, Jimmy Hart, David Cannell and his wife, Fidel Sierra and Natasha, Steve Kieran, Ron Reed, Buddy Colt Luthez, Don Curtis, Lucy Gossett, Eddie Graham's widow, Judy Matsuda, Hero's widow, Joe Malenko, Scott Hall, Dory Funk Jr., wrestling agent Chris Qualman, former referee Stu Schwartz, George Scott, and Tony Marino. The Tampa Tribune reported that superstar Billy Graham was in attendance, but he was not, although his mother-in-law, who had been friends with Solie for 40 years, was. Dusty Rhodes, who may, even more than Jack Briscoe, have been the wrestler most synonymous with Solie's announcing career, was not there. As was well known inside wrestling, despite them coming across as the best of friends on television, their real-life relationship was somewhat the opposite. Solie, who had specifically requested he didn't want Rhodes invited to the party for him, that ironically was scheduled for the same day, finally made peace with him in his own mind a few days before he died as noted in the statement, "Let bygones be bygones." Reports we've received was the EMLL's second ever pay-per-view on August 4th in Mexico was an overall great show. We'll have a complete report in a week or two after getting the videotape. The show drew a sellout of 17,803 to Arena Mexico in Mexico City, and ended with Mascara Anno 2000, Jesus Reyes, losing his hair for the first time in his career in a four-way cage match with Villano Tercero, Arturo Diaz Mendoza, Pierroth Jr., Norberto Salgado. Neither of whom had ever lost a hair match in their career, although that's because they were masked men up until recently, and Pero Aguayo, Pedro Aguayo. 1. Ciclanchito Ramirez and Bracito de Oro and Ultimo Dragonchito beat Fire and Firito and Pierroth Tito via countout after a triple dive in what was said to have been an excellent minis opener. 2. Negro Casas and Brazo de Plata and Lismark Jr. won via low blow DQ over El Satanico and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Bestia Salvaje. Satanico and Salvaje were subs for Shocker, who instead took a booking that night in Tijuana, and Apollo Dantes, who was there but instead did interference in the main event. No report on match quality, but it sounds like a bad third, fall finish. 3. Rey Bucanero and Ultimo Guerrero won the final match of the recent tournament to crown new CMLL Tag Team Champions, beating Villano 4 and Mr. Niebla. It was actually Niebla and Emilio Charles Jr. that had won their block in the tournament a few weeks back to make the finals. Charles Jr. came out and was said he couldn't wrestle due to an injury, and Villano replaced him. At first, the commission announced Bucanero and Guerrero were winning the titles due to injury forfeit, and even though they are Rudos, they refused to accept them and wanted to wrestle in the match. I've got different stories about what happened, but apparently the commission ordered the Rudos as champion because it was a title to be decided in a tournament, and you can't sub a new guy in a tournament final for the credibility of the tournament. What a strange concept they have in the rest of the world of wanting it to make sense. They ended up, after getting the belts, then doing the match and winning what was said to have been an excellent match. 4. In a mask elimination match, with the rules that whomever wins a pinfall then leaves the match, as opposed to a traditional elimination match where it is the loser who is eliminated, the ultimate loser was El Hijo del Gladiador. Dr. O'Borman Jr. was eliminated first when he made Rincor Latino submit to a half crab. Olympico was out next, making Astro Rey Jr. submit with a tire buzan. I don't know what that is either. Safari was next out, pinning Blue Panther. Black Warrior was then out when Solar was counted out of the ring. Violencia was out when he made Mascara Magica submit to the half crab. Pantera was out when he pinned Rincor Latino. Solar got out, pinning Gladiador. Astro Rey Jr. was out, pinning Mascara Magica. Magica then got out when his hand was raised by DQ after double teaming by Rincor Latino and Gladiador because the rules prohibited any 2-on-1 situations. This left Latino versus Gladiador, with Latino scoring the pin, and was unmasked as Arturo Ramirez, 49, from Mexico City, who started using the Gladiador name in 1984, after previously losing his mask in a 1984 match to Atlantis when he was known as Talisman. This isn't the same wrestler who was the Talisman Jr. from the 90s that was the first husband of Akira Hokuto. Anyway, this was said to have been the best match on the show. 5. Mascara Anno 2000 was the ultimate loser in the four-way cage match. The rules were they had to wrestle for 7 minutes before anyone could escape the cage, and the final man left in the cage would get his head shaved. Aguayo was the first man out. This left Mascara and Pierroth double-teaming Villano Tercero. Aguayo tried to risk his hair but helped Villano as a pure babyface move, but was stopped by Apollo Dantes, Cien Caras and Universo 2000. This allowed Mascara Anno 2000 to escape. As he saw Villano Tercero destroying Pierroth, he also went back into the cage to make it a 2-on-1. During the brawl, Pierroth accidentally gave Mascara a low blow. Then when Mascara and Pierroth beat down Villano again and Mascara went to leave, Pierroth turned on him and left and started laughing. At that point, the remaining Dinamita brothers outside the cage as well as Dantes all attacked Pierroth. With Villano and Mascara Anno 2000 as the final two men in the ring, they went to regular singles match rules and Villano made him submit to end the match. Despite little in the way of competition, wrestling numbers were down on August 14th overall, with Raw's 6.28 rating largely drawing during the unopposed hour, 5.51 first hour, 7.04 second hour, ending with a 10.1 share. Nitro drew its third lowest rating since the show went to 2 hours in history with a 2.44 rating, 2.72 first hour, 2.15 second hour, and a 4.1 share. The total audience watching wrestling was 9.0 million during the head-to-head hour, which is actually less than watched Raw's main event by itself. Raw also got approximately 45% of the Nitro audience to switch over when that show ended, which is an amazingly high figure. Raw's three-way with Triple H vs. Angle vs. Jericho did a 6.89 final quarter and a 7.78 overrun. The Rock vs. Benoit title match drew a 7.02 quarter, which was actually a slight drop from the huge numbers the Stephanie, Angle, Triple H and Foley interview put up at 7.09. The head-to-head quarters saw Raw at 5.07, Rock challenging Benoit to a title match, to 1.99, Sting vs. Scott Steiner, Raw at 4.95, X-Pac vs. Rikishi to 2.56, Booker T vs. Storm, Kidman and Tori Wilson, Raw at 5.93, Dudley's vs. RTC, to 1.86, Chronic Animals Angle and Tigress, Hancock and Guns in the Mud Pit, and Raw at 6.09, Too Cool and China vs. Venus and Tanda and beginning of Stephanie/Triple H and Ring Angle, to 2.21, Awesome vs. Jarrett, Steiners vs. Nash and Sting. SmackDown on August 10th drew a 4.58 rating and 8.0 share, which is actually down slightly from the previous week despite all three major networks carrying the Republican convention, and thus it should be advantageous to drawing a huge number. With the networks splitting the audience, it did put Raw for the first time ever in second place in the top 40 metered markets behind only ABC, and in third overall behind NBC. The show won its slot among adults 18 to 34, males 18 to 49 and teenagers. The show also won its time slot in 4 markets: Los Angeles, 8,0, Raleigh, 10.2, Memphis, 9.8, and Jacksonville, 7.5, as well as placed second in 15 markets including New York, 9.3, Chicago, 8.1, Philadelphia, 6.6, Dallas, 8.6, and Houston, 8.9. Thunder on August 9th drew a 2.34 rating and a 3.9 share against the convention. Weekend ratings for August 5th to 6th saw Livewire at 1.1, 5th highest show of the day on the station, Superstars at 1.1, 14th highest rated show on the station, and actually it was the second lowest rated show on USA Network between 10 a.m. and midnight, and Heat at 2.61, highest rated show on station. Heat was on the low end of what they usually get, while both Livewire and Superstars were well below normal figures. WCW Saturday Morning at 0.6 was the lowest rated show on TBS from 7 a.m. to 4 a.m. the next day. The only show that even came in the ballpark was a 7 a.m. rerun of Family Ties, and the movie Blue Lagoon that aired from 1:15 to 3:30 a.m. overnight did nearly double the rating wrestling did. ECW on TNN drew an 0.83 rating and 1.7 share, or more than double the rating of any other show on TNN for the day. The second highest rated show on the station, the Oklahoma at San Jose Arena Football League playoff game which followed wrestling, drew an 0.32. The Lucha Libre block on Galavision on August 1st drew a 1.6 Hispanic rating. Mexico. The debut of the new Guas will be on August 26th at the Palacio de los Deportes, 30,000 capacity, in Mexico City as a TV taping for TV Azteca. The show will be headlined by a tournament in which the loser loses his mask with Solar, Shu El Guerrero, La Parca, Dr. Wagner Jr., Villano V, Blue Panther, Lizmark, and Mascara Sagrada. Shu is the most likely loser. They also have Silver King and Dandy and Enrique Vera. Geez, I remember him from 27 years ago working Northern California, against Jake Roberts and Doink and Marty Jannetty. AAA sent a threatening legal letter to EMLL claiming they owned the rights to the cage match gimmick in Mexico and asked EMLL for $50,000 for leasing the rights for the pay-per-view show over the weekend. It is funny that the Mexico City Commission never allowed AAA to do cage matches, but the first time EMLL wants to, there is no problem with it. Hector Garza won a tournament on July 18th in Tamaulipas to earn a shot at Cibernetico's Champion of Champions, which Cibernetico retained via count-out. Nicho El Millonario Psicosis is doing an angle in Tijuana with younger brother Phobia. Phobia is a Rudo while Nicho is back as a babyface, but Nicho refuses to wrestle against him when they are in the tag matches together. Phobia is getting the big push as on the August 4th main event with Keto Kung Lee Jr. and Damien vs. La Parca and Halloween in an Parejas Increíbles match. Opponents become partners. The finish saw Phobia destroy Parca with a chair shot and he did a stretcher job. Gross acne story of the week. Scorpio Jr., whose body is lined with it as a combination of both genetics and probably other reasons that spur body acne, would hit the ropes and the zits would pop and bleed all over the place. Damien vs. Pimpinela Escarlata in a hair match headlined August 7th in Nuevo Laredo. Gigante Silva returns to Arena Mexico on August 11th for the main event, teaming with Brazo de Plata and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. against Shocker and Scorpio Jr., and Apollo Dantes and Cien Caras. AAA just did a 4-way cage match with the loser losing his hair with Kickboxer, loser, against Toro Irison, Hector Garza, and Heavy Metal. Lady Apache, the CMLL Women's Champ, announced she was vacating her title and leaving the company. EMLL has introduced its version of the Nitro Girls to dance between matches. Dos Caras Jr. will be debuting soon for AAA, but will start his career in Japan. IWRG has a 3-way stip match on August 13th in Naucalpan with Ciclone Ramirez, IWRG welterweight title belt, Mika Segura, hair, and Dr. Cerebro, mask. All Japan. It was announced that there will be a Giant Baba Memorial show on September 30th, which would be the 40th anniversary of his pro debut on September 30th, 1960. Pro Wrestling Noah. They are running 4 September shows, September 15th and September 16th dates at their home base differ Ariake along with a September 24th show in Kyoto and September 25th in Osaka. There are talks of Koto Fuyuki working the latter 2 dates. The first tour, which will be 2 weeks long, starts October 7th at differ Ariake. Vader will return and Vader is booking the foreign talent as well. The December tour, instead of doing a tag team tournament which was the All Japan tradition, will be doing a singles tournament similar to the Champion Carnival. In the spring of 2001 they will create 4 new champions, a singles heavyweight champion, a tag team title, a junior heavyweight title and a junior heavyweight tag team title, to replace the former mid-card All-Asian tag team title. July 26 TV show was back down to the old All Japan levels with a 1.3 rating. New Japan. G1 Climax Tournament opened on August 7th and August 8th at the Osaka Furitsu Gym before an announced sellout 6,500 fans the first night and just under capacity at 6,000 the second night. TV Asahi announced a 3-hour special from 1:30 to 4:30 p.m. on August 13th airing highlights of the first 5 nights of G1. Media reports of the first show was considered a success, although we've also heard stories of the crowd being papered. There was no major news coming from the event as they simply did their 8 singles matches in a tournament that on paper lacks excitement and interest. The junior heavyweights both lost, as Jushin Liger lost to the figure 4 from Tatsumi Fujinami in 10:33 and Tatsuhito Takaiwa lost to the STF from Masahiro Chono in 14:22. The main event saw Hiroyoshi Tenzan pin Manabu Nakanishi in 18:21. Reports are the last 2 were great matches. They are doing a gimmick where Hiro Saito vowed to not lose one match during the tournament by doing no contests every time out, thus no opponent will score a point on him since both guys get 0 points for no contest. But that ended the second night as he tried to pull Brian Johnston out of the ring, but Johnston got him back in and beat him with a sleeper. His opening night match, which was a no contest, was with Osamu Kido. On the August 8th show, Nagata, who most are tabbing as a co-favorite with Tenzan, pinned Fujinami clean, while Liger and Takaiwa both jobbed for Iizuka and Junji Hirata respectively. Thus far remaining unbeaten after the first 2 nights are Nagata, 1-0 Iizuka, 2-0 Tadao Yasuda, 1-0 Kensuke Sasaki, 1-0 Shiro Koshinaka, 1-0 Chono, 2-0, and Hirata, 2-0. Even though Takaiwa is 0-2, reports are he had the best match against Chono and Hirata no less, on both nights. Yasuda did an interview saying that he wanted a match with Masaaki Sadake, which may take place either at the Pride Show on August 27th at the Seibu Dome or at the New Japan October 9th Tokyo Dome. They are strongly hinting that Masa Fuchi from All Japan will do a surprise appearance at one of the 3 G1 shows at Sumo Hall from August 11th to August 13th to start an All Japan vs. New Japan program, most likely on August 11th. Also at the August 13th show, they are going to have a ceremony to introduce Japan's Olympic wrestling team, which includes Katsuhiko Nagata, the younger brother of Yuji. They announced 3 major events for next year: the traditional Jan. 4th show at the Tokyo Dome, a 30th anniversary show in the spring at the new Tokyo Stadium, being built for the 2002 World Cup, and a July 20th show at the new Sapporo Dome. New Japan actually debuted on March 6, 1972 at the Oto Ward Gym in Tokyo, but because it would be in competition with the World Cup, the feeling is that they should do the 30th anniversary 1 year early. There is a lot of talk that Inoki, Seiji Sakaguchi and Riki Choshu would all wrestle on that show. July 29th TV show consisted of 2 matches. They are the Kojima and Tenzan over Nagata and Nakanishi IWGP Tag Title Change, which was a 3 1/4 match. Your typical solid New Japan match with a good finish. Tenzan hit Nakanishi with a moonsault, followed by Kojima dropping the elbow off the top, Tenzan with a forearm off the top until finally Kojima hit a lariat and scored the pin. The other bout was Sasaki keeping the heavyweight title over Iizuka. Match wasn't too good early and people didn't seem to buy Iizuka as a challenger. Iizuka got a choke sleeper and the people seemed to get into it. After a series of lariats by Iizuka, when he got the sleeper back on, the people were really into it, but Sasaki broke a sleeper on the ground and a standing sleeper. Sasaki came back with 2 Ipanzais, judo hip toss, followed by 2 lariats and a Northern Lights bomb and another 3 1/4 match. July 29th TV show drew a 2.7 rating, and the August 5th show, which had the Choshu vs. Onita pay-per-view main event and the Takaiwa Jr. title win over Liger, drew a 3.9. Other Japan notes. Saw the TV from Toriuman's biggest show to date on June 4th at Kobe World Memorial Hall, which drew a sellout 6,500 for the small indie company. It was an entertaining show overall. The opener with Asia Kong vs. Stalker Ichikawa was mainly weird comedy. Ichikawa came out doing a total spoof of Hoist Gracie. This was 5 weeks after the Sakuraba match. He came out with a Gracie train, but then he stumbled and the fall fell down on purpose. In the ring, he did the old Hoist Gracie stance and wore a gi until it was ripped off him, and when the pants were ripped off, it showed that he had stuffed his privates. Eventually Kong, who is twice his size, got in the mount and started pounding on him, and the corner threw in the towel. Somewhere in the match Ichikawa also grabbed Kong's breasts, or what passes for them, which was quite weird. Suwa's NWA welterweight title match with Dragon Kid showed a few things. Dragon Kid, for moves, is as good as Mysterio Jr. in his prime. But as a worker, he's still at the level Mysterio Jr. was at 18. Since this was a long match, he was really exposed for not being ready to work a long singles matches. Most of his experiences in Mexico doing trios, so that shouldn't be considered that unusual. He did many moves that were out of this world. Besides his Dragon Rana, the finisher was tremendous as Suwa went for an Undertaker-style power bomb. Dragon reversed it into a Hurricane Rana, and before they landed, Suwa had reversed it again into a sunset flip. Main event was Mexican style with Tiger Mask and Great Sasuke vs. Shima and Sumo Dandy Fuji, with the losers then having to face each other in either a mask versus mask or hair versus hair match. This match was in the 4 stars range since Tiger Mask looked out of this world. He may be the most underrated worker around. The other 3 looked good as well. Mask used a chicken wing crossface into a German suplex, followed by a tiger suplex on Fuji for the pin. This led to Shima vs. Fuji, which was good, but not nearly as good as the previous match, with Shima winning with a frog splash, which is called the Mad Splash. Takahiro Murahama of Osaka Pro Wrestling, who has experience in kickboxing, will fight on the September 9th Rings show at Korakuen Hall against Gabriel Lemley, a student of Pat Militic from Iowa. September 15th GM main event for the Yokohama Bunka Gym is Crush Gals 2000, Linus Asuka and Chigusa Nagayo vs. Dynamite Kansai and Asia Kong. Yuko Kosugi, who turned 20 last week, announced her retirement on August 3rd at Korakuen Hall after losing a best-of-3 fall match to Bloody. Kosugi has wrestled for JD for the past 3 years. At the August 6th Big Japan show in Tokyo in the main event, a fire death match with Nick Gage and John Zandig against Mitsuhiro Matsunaga and Jun Kasai. Among the highlights were the Japanese running over Zandig with a car, Gage setting fire to the mat, and a body slam off the top of a truck through a table. Here and there. Roddy Piper is looking at writing a book. Added to the list of wrestlers that have attended the Republican convention should be Ernie Ladd, who has attended more than one, and in fact, read the invocations on August 2nd at the Republican lunch. Ladd was introduced as a former pro football star with no mention made about pro wrestling. Jack Briscoe's planned surgery to remove part of his intestine from a few weeks back was delayed because he contracted pneumonia, and it is now scheduled for August 14th. The USA Weekend Sunday newspaper supplement, final poll online dating back to June 23rd about which sport is our national pastime, wrestling or baseball, and the reality is neither, it's football, came up with 55% for wrestling and 44% for baseball. The Mr. Ebony who passed away in December was named Stephen Castor, not Tom Jones, who was the more famous Mr. Ebony working at the time. Bill Needham, a longtime Knoxville area wrestling personality who corresponded for various publications including this one, as well as did ring announcing and promoted numerous indie shows, passed away on August 6th due to complications from cancer he had been battling for more than a year. Needham last year had his leg amputated due to cancer but returned and was back ring announcing. He'd been in poor health for some time and his death was not unexpected. Tony Nash, 30, of Milwaukee became the third death directly related to activity inside the ring in the United States this year. Nash, working his first pro wrestling match for Wisconsin All-Star Wrestling at the Sussex Sports Bar in Milwaukee before 40 fans, failed to tuck his head while taking a back suplex and landed neck first. Nash, 6'3" and more than 300 pounds, who had trained at the company's wrestling school for 4 months, but was put into the match at the last minute when a wrestler no-showed the event, never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead at the Community Memorial Hospital in Munmunny Falls, Wisconsin. An exact cause of death hadn't been reported as of press time. Jamie Cardish, an actor who had worked Southern California indies a few years back under the name The Harlem Warlord, passed away on July 28 at the age of 32. He was a football star at Oklahoma State before training in wrestling. He starred opposite Tony Danza in a Disney TV movie The Garbage Picking, Field Goal Kicking, Philadelphia Phenomenon. The cause of death was complications from gallbladder surgery at Torrance, California Memorial Hospital. To give another example of how screwed up boxing is, the WBF World Heavyweight Boxing title is on the line on October 16th in Helsinki, Finland. The champion is K1 star Mike Bernardo, who hadn't boxed in years before winning the vacant title, beating a non-opponent. His next defense is against Tony Halme, the former WWF star Ludwig Borga, best known in wrestling for those deadly main events against Lex Luger. And in thinking back to that period, I guess it is no wonder that was such a down period for the WWF. The cover story in the Canadian publication The Report was on the Hart family. They talked about all the family's recent problems, including Stu being hospitalized for a week with pneumonia, Helen having a blood clot in her leg in June, and the guest house fire, along with the potential career-ending injury of Brett, of which Helen was quoted as saying, "The doctors all seem to think he should step out of wrestling permanently." The story did mention, regarding the lawsuit, that the clasp used to suspend Owen in the stunt was built for sailboats and would open with only 7 pounds of pressure. The inventor of the clasp cringed when he talked to lawyers and learned it was used for suspending a human being in midair. The device was actually invented for quick release of a sail when the wind changes, and was designed for quick detachment and reattachment on the other side of the boat. It also noted that Stu and Helen are on the brink of financial insolvency, partially due to the problem with part of their land that was a major issue 2 years ago, which nearly resulted in the family losing their famous house. On the Australian tour, the final 5 shows were cancelled, so the tour is now over. Barbarian beat Kurt Hennig on August 2nd in Newcastle to win their heavyweight belt, but Hennig won it back on August 3rd in Perth. Hennig was telling people while on tour that he had a deal with WWF. At the shows on August 4th and August 5th, Hennig beat One Man Gang when they did the deal where they acted like Gang won the title with his feet on the ropes. Former boxer Joe Buhner ordered the match restarted and Hennig won with a quick cradle. Gang then put Buhner's punch over after the match after protesting. On August 6th at the Rod Laver Arena in Melbourne, Hennig pinned Dennis Rodman. Howard Brody is wanting to honor the legacy of Florida wrestling due to everything that has happened with his August 15th show at the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory, which was the home of Tuesday night matches in Tampa during the Glory Days, to honor Cowboy Luttrell, Eddie Graham, Duke Kyomika, Boris Malenko, Hiro Matsuda, Johnny Valentine, Carl von Stroheim, Buddy Colt, and Gordon Solie. Greg Valentine and Joe Malenko will be there to honor their fathers, as will Solie's sons Eric and Jonard and daughter Pam. Main event is Steve Kieran and Brian Blair versus Bushwhackers. On the FMW home videos that are about to be released, the commentary is largely based on scripts written by 3 California TV and film writers who had no knowledge of pro wrestling, let alone FMW. They were hired because it was felt for the mainstream audience they hoped to sell the videos to, that new storylines were needed. For example, Horace Boulder is instead called CPA, with a story that he used to work as an accountant for the Puerto Rican Mafia. They also created lesbian storylines with the Japanese women wrestlers. This was sort of given to me as a warning for readers interested in the tapes, to be prepared about the commentary. Rick Davidson, who wrestled as part of a tag team called the Davidson Brothers in the late 70s, was in the hospital over the past week fighting for his life with a staph infection. The NWA title tournament will take place on September 19th in Tampa. Dan Severn and Gary Steele are the only names confirmed. Showtime will be doing a special at 10 p.m. on August 20th on 7 of the most fascinating athletes in Olympic history, one of which will be Alexander Karelin, the Greco-Roman wrestler who did one highly publicized pro wrestling match last year in Japan against Akira Maeda. Jacques Rougeau's Loot International 2000 promotion drew an estimated 3,500 fans on August 2nd at the Old Verdun Auditorium to see roughly the 1,000th reprise of the legendary Rougeau's vs. Garvin's feud as he and brother Raymond beat Jimmy and Ronnie Garvin to win the Johnny Rougeau tag team titles. In the mid-80s, the Rougeau's vs. Garvins had an incredible feud up in Montreal. As the story goes, Jacques was potatoed in that match by a double clothesline that accidentally hit his Adam's apple. On August 4th, he claimed to have gone to a fast food joint with his son. He took a bite out of a hot dog, which went down the wrong way, dislodging the Adam's apple, and he keeled over, unconscious. As he fell, he landed breaking his nose, and blackening both his eyes, and spent the night in a Joliette, Quebec hospital. The good news, as he told friends, and this is one of those deals where you may want to read between the lines, he made the 6 p.m. TV newscast the next day. And on the next day, during halftime of the Montreal Alouettes vs. Saskatchewan Roughriders CFL game, he wrestled and beat King Kong Bundy at halftime in front of a sellout of nearly 20,000 fans. Rougeau, however, due to the injury from Wednesday's match, was unable to talk. Rougeau also claimed to have a meeting set up with WCW over the next week. The release date of Billy Graham's autobiography is at this point set for December 1st. Puerto Rico TV ratings for the past week. July 29th saw WWC at 12.2 and 39 share, IWA at 6.5 and 20 share, and WWF at 8.3 and 16 share. July 30th saw WWC at 11.5 and 35 share and IWA at 5.3 and 16 share. K-Town Showdown's August 4th show was a major letdown and drew just 550 fans. With the OVW guys not there since they had a major show of their own at the Louisville Gardens, the card was based around a one-night tourney for the old USA title, which Jimmy Golden won, winning 3 matches in less than 5 total minutes of time combined, including a win over Buddy Landell in 1 minute in the title match. No shows included Georgia Jawjacker, Bob Armstrong scheduled for a mask versus mask main event against a fake assassin, Steve Armstrong and Bill Dundee. The Urban Wrestling Federation, or whomever it was using the guys from that group, moved the proposed August 25th date in Los Angeles to a September 9th date, although not confirmed for the Olympic Auditorium. Extra. Ran a feature on XPW on August 2nd. It claimed XPW packs arenas around the country, which is a good one. Basically negative piece, claiming XPW lead kids to do backyard wrestling where they could get hurt and talked about the porn stars involved and saying it's banned in New Jersey. UWF is also looking for some Lucha Libre wrestlers. I believe both Ohio Valley Wrestling and NWA Worldwide out of Nashville this past week dedicated their TV shows to Soli. NWA Worldwide had what was billed as its Tennessee Legends show on August 5th at the Fairgrounds in Nashville before 300 fans, included appearances by Tommy and Doug Gilbert, who apparently beat IWA Japan prelim wrestler Yuji Kito and Brickhouse Brown in a tremendous match, and Tim Renisto, real name John Renisto, who wrestled doing an Indian gimmick as Tim Talltree in California some 20 years ago. Among the people inducted into their Hall of Fame were Tom Renisto, famous as Assassin No. 1 in The Great Bolo as a top Southern draw in the 60s and very well respected as a booker for numerous offices, who passed away recently, Jerry Barber, Eddie Gilbert, who got a long-standing ovation, Mike Porter, Sam Bass, whose plaque will be accepted soon by Jerry Lawler. Bass was Lawler's first manager in the early 70s, Nick Gulas, who promoted the area for some 40 years, and was very much an infamous promoter in the wrestling world, Roughhouse Fargo and Ronnie Gossett. MMA. The August 27th Seibu Dome show, Ken Shamrock vs. Kazuyuki Fujita, Kazushi Sakuraba vs. Henzo Gracie, Kendo Kashin vs. Ryan Gracie, Enson Inoue vs. Igor Vovchinchin, etc. will air on US pay-per-view, at least for those who have dishes, on September 8th, with a 4-hour show which should, being that there aren't any no-time limit matches on this card, enable every match to air in its entirety. It is also airing live on pay-per-view in Japan and Brazil. There is talk of adding Wanderlei Silva vs. Guy Mesger to that show. Fujita has been training in Southern California with Boss Rutan for the match. Tentative September 22nd UFC lineup for New Orleans is Tito Ortiz vs. Yuki Kondo for the middleweight title as the main event. Kondo, a former king of Pancrase, is usually an exciting fighter to watch and is really good with submissions and an exciting well-rounded fighter, while Ortiz is the bigger man, the better wrestler who can also box with his reach advantage. You never know, but it is one of those matches that looks good on paper. Also Pedro Rizzo vs. Gary Goodridge, Eugene Jackson vs. Jeremy Horn, Maurice Smith vs. Bobby Hoffman, Laverne Clark vs. Fabiano Iha, Ian Freeman vs. Ted Williams, Tim Lajic vs. Noe Hernandez, and Brad Gum vs. Rudyard Moncayo. K1 ran its second event in the U.S. at the Bellagio in Las Vegas on August 5th, a taping for ESPN2, although I have no idea when it will air. Russian Andrei Dudko won the tournament, beating Tomasz Kuszarzewski in the finals. He had a war with Roman Reutberg in the first round but took advantages of leg injuries suffered in earlier matches to make short work of Paul Lalonde and Kuszarzewski. There will be a Best of the IVC, Brazilian Vale Tudo, pay-per-view show on October 2nd, airing only on Viewer's Choice in Canada. ECW. ECW will be doing a one-night tournament for its tag titles on August 25th at the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York, capacity 5,000. They'll also be running the next night in the same building. Some of the first-round matches will be Sandman and Chili Willy vs. Credible and Rhino, Tao and Whipwreck vs. FBI, During and Roadkill vs. Baldies and Van Dam and Cash vs. Lynn and Dreamer. Also in the tournament will be Nova and Chetty, Diamond and Swinger and Matthew and York. The August 26th show will have 3 title defenses. Not much major on the August 4th tapings in Huntington, West Virginia aside from Corino and Anton turning babyface against the rest of the network, and in particular Rhino and Credible. They've also teased future dissension with Rhino and Credible. Several wrestlers from San Antonio came up, and the general feeling is they had tremendous attitudes and people were raving about the job Shawn Michaels had done with them. The only one who appeared at the TV tapings was Michael Shane, who looked good losing to Red Dog. Shane did an awesome tope and a springboard cannonball. This match wasn't taped for TV. Julio Fantastico is now being called Julio Dinero, being put together as a trio with Chris Hamrick and Easy Money. Prada Jet, Angel Orsini, bleached her hair blonde to make her look more like a woman, as opposed to her previous role where she was supposed to look like a guy. C.W. Anderson destroyed both her and Jazz, saying that because he's an Anderson, he doesn't like watching women wrestle. Louis dangerously got tremendous heat simply doing old time running down the city. The ring was pelted with garbage because of poor security. They did a Danger Zone segment, a play on the old Danger Zone segment Paul Heyman did when he was a manager. Corino complained that the network chose Credible and Rhino to be their reps in the tag tourney. Corino said he and Anton were the ones responsible for Credible and Rhino keeping their titles. Credible came out to no pop and started talking. In the middle of this, a fan nailed Louis with a drink which stopped the interview. Credible responded, "If you assholes throw that shit again, this F***ing show is over." They got back into the angle at that point. Credible started doing his catchphrase and Corino interrupted, calling it the worst catchphrase in wrestling. Rhino then came out and he and Credible laid out Corino and Anton, leaving them as faces. The idea is that Anton's clap is going to be a babyface comeback spot. This left Credible and Kid Cash to wrestle without a finish in a ring soaked with soda and beer. Rhino and Van Dam both interfered. Maine saw Van Dam beat Mahoney in what was said to be a 3.5 match. The payroll has been made regularly, but everyone is still one pay period behind. As a cost-cutting measure, Lynn Graziano, the Baldies, Cyrus, Gertner, Styles, and Ref Jim Molyneux were all not flown in for TV this week. New Jack will be out 4 to 6 more weeks after having minor foot surgery stemming from all his recent injuries. The first match in the tag tourney was built up on the August 4th TNN show as Willie, in his highest profile appearance, saved Sandman from a beating by Rhino and Credible. Willie looks like a younger version of Craig Pittman. Dreamer and Anton had a better than usual Dreamer brawl, with Dreamer bleeding and taking a suplex onto a ladder before getting the pin after interference from both Jazz and Lynn. They also teased an eventual Rhino vs. Credible program with TV Champ against World Champ in a closing interview as they hooked the two up as a team. Psicosis missed the August 4th TV tapings in Huntington, West Virginia, working in Tijuana instead. He's supposed to start full-time as a regular this coming weekend. August 19th at ECW Arena in Philadelphia has Psicosis vs. Tao, Dreamer and During, and Roadkill vs. Swinger and Diamond and Anderson, and Van Dam and Cash vs. Credible and Rhino. WCW. Russo and Goldberg had a meeting on August 2nd with Brad Siegel. The gist of the meeting, as we're told, is that Russo told Goldberg that Nash would be winning the three-way to get a shot at Booker T on the September pay-per-view in Buffalo by pinning Steiner, but that Steiner would then pin Goldberg on the Buffalo show. Goldberg basically refused, and his position in the company long-term is considered tenuous at this point, with rumors flying everywhere they're trying to get rid of him. At this point he has 3 years left on his contract and there have been no talks, either formally or informally, as it pertains to Goldberg, or anyone else, regarding buying them out of their contract. Not that this won't be tried at some point. Much of the current talent getting pushed for the first time seriously has mobilized behind Russo for the belief he's moved the guys who were keeping everyone down away. Some, probably most, of those in the office with wrestling experience still believe virtually everything going on to be a gigantic work and there is no trust of anything, although the Goldberg problems with management are definitely real. Goldberg has been painted in the circles of the wrestlers as a prima donna who won't do jobs or business, particularly by those closest to Russo and Johnny Ace. Those close to Goldberg say he has no problem putting people over, but wants to know what the long-term plans for the company are, where it's going, and wants to do angles that have continuity and make sense. For his part, Goldberg was back at Nitro this week and was said to be very quiet backstage. Not much to the Thunder show taped on August 1st. They built the show around the Russo interview, which never aired. They also had to edit out a lot of comments made about the interview after it had supposedly played. However, they didn't edit the bumpers and all the hype associated with the interview out, which made the whole show come off as totally amateurish. Several Leigh Thatcher students, including Cody Hawk, Grace Steele, Anthony McMurphy, Rory Fox and Matt Stryker were used as worldwide jobbers. Several others also took bumps as security guys during the show. Cat forced Storm to defend all 3 titles, which he did. He beat Guerrera in a cruiserweight match, which is now the under 100 kilogram division, trying to rub metric in the faces of the Americans, I guess. Match was good, but could have been better. Guerrera's enthusiasm to perform in the ring is nothing compared with even 1 year ago. Elix Skipper, already rid of Skipover as a name, beat Kidman when Rick Cornell, given the ring name Reno, Shane Douglas, and Torrie Wilson all got involved. Skipper again didn't look good and also messed up his finisher. O'Haire beat Stasiak in a real bad match with no crowd heat. Palumbo, as if he's one to talk, talked about how green O'Haire was. Tenay stood up for O'Haire, and was then made to look stupid as both guys looked so tentative that the Green could see they were out there on prime time way over their heads. Storm beat Smiley in a decent match where they actually allowed Smiley to mat wrestle, which is where his talent is. Bagwell beat Douglas when Kidman interfered. Judy Bagwell, who actually has gotten more annoying. The idea is to make her Mae Young, but instead it's a gimmick that buries Buff as a mama's boy with a trailer park mom. Bagwell went out on a stretcher in a neck brace after a diamond cutter by Canyon onto a chair. Speaking of Diamond Cutter, the story is that Page wants to return but they don't want to bring him back. It's clear the idea is to not let any of the former stars with old faces on TV, although one can note Nash is only a few years younger than Page, but guess you have to cut it off somewhere, so the new guys are forced to be on top. From that standpoint it is a sound strategy because the old perception was killing the company. The major points of the first Russo interview, that didn't air, was him trying to get the Hogan thing over as a shoot. He said he'd quit if Hogan was brought back. He claimed he left the WWF because there was nothing left to accomplish since they were drawing 6.9 and 7.0 ratings when he left. Actually they were averaging 6.2 when he left and only topped 7.0 twice on opposed nights. Vince McMahon's supposed final show ever after losing to Austin and the day after Owen Hart's death. He said that when he was in WWF, everyone laughed at WCW. That is no doubt true for most of 1999 when they hit the freefall. But what Russo fails to recognize is that WWF has laughed at WCW far more since he got there. He said they used to call WCW a cash machine. The deal with WCW's big contracts that people fail to recognize is that it isn't the contracts per se that were the problem, it was the failure to create stars. In 1998, the company was hugely profitable. Even though the top guys were making millions, if you look at the profit margin, they were being underpaid. In 1999, those same salaries were overpaid, because the revenue fell because the booking was so atrocious. This year everyone is terribly overpaid because the company is losing its ass. But that's because it is being run for ego and not as a business. He didn't say anything bad about Bischoff other than he was forced to come back with Bischoff this last time. He said he was served with a lawsuit by Hogan's attorneys. He said Booker T is the start of the turnaround and the next pay-per-view would be the pinnacle of that the company should be. He said he doesn't like some of the people in the company and said there is Amy syndrome instead of AWE syndrome in a few of them. Awesome beat Canyon when Judy Bagwell hit Canyon with her purse. Storm beat Cat when Muta interfered on Cat in a US title match. TV main was Sting and T and Chronic over Jarrett and Vampiro and Demon and Muta in an elimination match with Sting and Booker scoring pins on Vampiro and Demon. Nitro on August 7th from Denver was a somewhat strong show in spots, in particular Booker T versus Storm, and really bad in other spots, such as Judy Bagwell. Vampiro and Muta and Demon beat Young Dragons in a scary match, since they brought in a high ladder, and Hayashi slipped trying to do a big dive off the top. But he was okay. Muta pinned Yang with a moonsault on his already crippled knees before Sting cleaned house with a bat. Sting challenged Goldberg, but Goldberg, Nash and Steiner were going at it backstage. Somehow Steiner was able to walk out while the others weren't, using a pipe, and destroyed Sting to set up a pipe on a pole match for 30 minutes later, by which time Sting was 100% fine and not selling anything from several apparently hard body shots with a pipe. Storm challenged T to a title match, which the fans booed. When Cat tried to turn the crowd to cheer for the match, the response was still only lukewarm, which is ironic since the crowd was super hot for the match. Chronic beat Jindrak and O'Haire via DQ and Stasiak and Palumbo interfered using the Lex Flexor. Jindrak and O'Haire turned heel to help Stasiak and Palumbo. The FAs came out as well, stealing the tag belts and running off after MIA saved. Bagwell, who went out in an ambulance on Wednesday, came out fine, not selling anything. Buff and Judy then beat Canyon and Pamela Paulshock. Canyon was supposed to team with Torrie but she refused to go out. Canyon punched Judy. This was hilarious. Buff wasn't even concerned his mom got punched out. She took the lamest bump. Kanyon went after Paul Shock, but Mean Gene ran in as fast as those short-aged legs would take him and kicked Kanyon low, leading to Bagwell doing the blockbuster for the pin. Russo did this version of the interview. He stood by his statement WWF ratings were doing a 6.9 and 7.0 when he left. Actually, the last show he wrote drew a 5.92. He said WCW ratings went from a 2.8 to a 3.4 his first time in. Actually, his first show in a 3-hour time slot against Football drew a 3.30, up from a 2.61 for a lame duck show from Nash. The 2.61 was a fluke since the shows in September, the month before Russo came, averaged a 3.38 against Football. His last 3-hour show against Football drew a 2.86, so numbers were declining during that first tenure, not increasing. He did draw a 3.38 his last show when Football ended and Nitro went to 2 hours, but that is the equivalent of a 2.9 for a 3-hour show against Football, and that ended up being an aberration because it was a 2.98 the next week, technically after Russo was gone, but that couldn't be used as an excuse since so few viewers would have known since it was never addressed on TV, so the trending downward at a quicker rate was already starting, which continued. More important is that during that same period, Hal's show business and PPVs declined greatly, which is why the money losses, which is the real numbers a company needs to worry about and not simply TV ratings on Monday, escalated during that period he was in control. Those losses are minute compared to the current level. It is true the Sullivan period was far worse and TV ratings plummeted and losses escalated. Overall, the TV has improved greatly from the Sullivan period, but the ratings average for the Sullivan period and post-Sullivan period for Nitro are roughly identical, and post-Sullivan had less network competition due to it now being rerun season, and the losses have grown at an even faster rate. Sullivan's 11 weeks averaged a 2.80, but that's a little misleading because he got 1 week unopposed, so throwing that out the real figure is 2.72. In the 18 weeks since, the show, which is a better show, has averaged a 2.66, and throwing out the week it was on a Tuesday and the first week, which was a throwaway, gets it up to 2.73. In 7 of the 18 shows since Russo took over, the rating fell below the 2.52 level, which was the all-time low mark for the show since going to 2 hours dating back to 1996, but he also topped 3.004 times, a figure Sullivan was never going to top at the rate he was going. While Russo joked that WCW was considered an ATM machine when he worked in the WWF, all joking aside about huge salaries, WCW made a tremendous profit in 1998, so wrestlers by and large were not overpaid based on what they drew, a fact those in the WWF in that period couldn't accept. Its losses, about $15 million, for the entire year of 1999, are about what the company today will be doing over the next 2 months. It is true that WWF ratings haven't really improved since he left. Well, actually SmackDown improved greatly, particularly after the show was toned down, and the weekend shows went down, probably due to the addition of SmackDown. Raw's numbers are realistically behind last year's numbers. On paper they look pretty even, but Raw has a second hour unopposed it didn't have when Russo was writing, and taking that out of the mix, you've got a realistic decline, and that's with weaker competition coming from Nitro in the opposed hour as well. That's more decline overall in wrestling interest. But again, focusing on ratings is misleading, because in the big picture, it is only one of dozens of spokes in the wheel. Ratings stayed steady for Raw, but the company grew from $251.5 million to $379.3 million in annual revenue, and is coming off a $116.4 million 3-month revenue period, which indicates the growth curve is still ascending even as the TV audience for Monday Night Wrestling has declined. To say the company has stayed the same since he left is totally misleading, but using Raw ratings as the only gauge, he would be accurate. Overall, he did a very good interview, if not self-serving, and in spots, incredibly so. Scott Steiner beat Sting in the pole match when Rick interfered, got the pole and threw it to Scott for the win. The pipe actually did a piñata, falling off the pole. Steiner had to go around ringside to get it to do his run-in. Apparently the winner was the first guy simply to have the pole in his hand. Nash saved to set up a tag match later. T pinned Storm with the Ura Nage in 5:35 of a tremendous match. This was the first time T really came across like a world champion. Jarrett attacked T's knee with the Canadian flag. Jarrett and Storm also went at it, with Jarrett hitting Heidi, Austin's valet, at ringside doing Mama Cass jokes about delivering a ton of ham sandwiches, with a guitar to set up Jarrett versus Awesome later. Kidman did a Tori appreciation deal showing a supposed video of her as a terribly overweight girl at the age of 16. taken from an episode of Friends which was much funnier as you can imagine. Kidman punched out Tori. Douglas and Reno then laid out Kidman and Douglas whipped him. FAs were trying to leave, beating up MIA. As they opened the garage, the 2 guys in Chronic were there. They scared the 4 guys in the FA so bad that Disco actually handed them the belts rather than fight. They laid him out anyway, including destroying another car in the process. Major Guns and Tigress ended up in a mud pit, as well as Miss Hancock, who didn't get muddy much past her knees. Jarrett beat Awesome with the stroke. Storm was on the apron and sent through a table, but when Awesome turned around, he got nailed. Some good false finishes early, but the crowd wasn't into the match. Sting and Nash beat Steiners in the main event when Scott had the recliner on Sting. Goldberg interfered and kicked Scott, which allowed Sting to pin him. Goldberg then, to make sure he didn't turn face for the pay-per-view, attacked Sting, leading to a square-off with Nash as the show ended. Page asked Kanyon to not use the diamond cutter and his mannerism since Page had no idea if he was even going to be brought back. Kanyon agreed, but was then told by Russo to keep doing it. Kanyon had asked for a release again a few weeks back. Bret Hart is booked for the 3 Canadian dates starting with the August 13th pay-per-view show. Regarding the WCW Hall of Fame inductions in 1995 and Gordon Solie's obit in last week's issue, Angelo Poffo got in, as mentioned last week, because his son, Randy Savage, was a major star in the company at the time and he pushed for it. Nobody in the decision-making part had any objections since Poffo was a star in the Midwest and had a big drawing feud at one point in the late 50s with Wilbur Snyder which spanned many different territories. The induction of John Studd was made because after he passed away his wife called WCW and asked if they could do it and again, even though his greatest fame came in the WWF, which apparently wouldn't do it, likely because Studd testified against Vince McMahon in the 1994 steroid trial. WCW agreed. As mentioned, Solie, who was not consulted on either of these, was against both. It should also be mentioned that Solie never had a hand in Angle's booking or major decision-making ever while he worked for the Georgia office, which was run by Jim Barnett from 1974 to 1983, or most of Solie's tenure with the promotion, and in Florida during that period. Virtually every major decision was made by Eddie Graham. Aldo Ortiz, ring name Ricky Santana, who was wrestling for the IWA in Puerto Rico, was backstage at Nitro as a road agent. Vader was also backstage at Nitro since it was in Denver. I believe the new Papaya, wife of Kiwi, is a stripper from Pittsburgh whose presence can be credited to Madden. A second show in Sydney, Australia has been added on October 10th after the October 9th Thunder taping sold out so quickly. There is some anger in Australia about Hogan not being on the tour since all the publicity building to these record gates. Virtually every city they are running will set an all-time gate record on this tour, was built around Hogan as the headliner. Predictions at press time were that the new Blood Rising show in Vancouver would do about $6,000 paid for about $175,000 Canadian, which would not be considered a success considering how well the early advance was. Even though the finishes look anything but Japanese-like, Johnny Ace is handling the finishes. They're building toward an angle with Gene Okerlund and Pamela Paulshock. There is a plan for maybe 18 to 24 months down the line to have TBS and TNT have entirely distinct identities, and at that point, Nitro would move to TBS. TNT would produce movies and first-run series, while TBS would concentrate on wrestling, baseball, basketball, etc. Fox is said to be close to picking up 13 episodes of a proposed TV show called Road Rage being developed by Bischoff and Jason Hervey of Mandalay Sports. Fox has yet to pick up the series, but discussions are said to be serious. The concept is to combine pro wrestling with Demolition Derby. There ended up being a good deal of heat on Nash for the manner in which he handled the Storm thing on his Nitro run-in on July 31st. Van Hammer was officially let go. Bigelow is still out of action because of the burns he suffered in a fire a few weeks back. Due to a problem with timing of setting the show up, the September 18th Nitro scheduled for Toronto has been moved to Kitchener. There is still talk within the company of trying to make more of an impact in Canada. The original idea for the Hardcore title instead of Saskatchewan Hardcore International title was for it to be called the Stu Hart International title. Bret Hart was called and asked if they could use his father's name on television, without being told what the purpose was. He said sure, if it wasn't done in a derogatory manner. They didn't even bother asking at that point and decided against doing the original plan. Hall is not cleared medically to wrestle due to his neck injury, nor is there a date yet given by his doctors when he would be cleared. His official status is he's on the injury list. He could be brought back to participate in angles but has not been asked. Thunder tapings on August 1st in Terre Haute, in drew 4,031 fans, which was 1,405 paying $35,770. Nitro on August 7th in Denver drew 3,851 paying $110,120. Merchandise from July 31st to August 6th, which actually just consisted of a Nitro and a Thunder, was $32,427 or $6.52 per head. The per head is based on paid attendance, and in both buildings the actual number in was more than double of the paid, so the real per caps is under $4. WWF. The political situation has gotten even more interesting with Senator Joseph Lieberman being announced as Al Gore's running mate. Lieberman has been very strong on the issue of television content, particularly as it pertains to programming watched by children, and is on the executive committee of the PTC. Dwayne Johnson and L. Brent Bozell had a short appearance together from the Republican convention on August 2nd, which aired on CNN. Johnson probably came off slightly better, but it really didn't accomplish anything. Bozell went on the offensive, saying how Johnson attacked a woman, spinebuster, on Trish Stratus on TV earlier in the week, which was a remarkably weak point given what could have been brought up about WWF content, even as it pertained to Monday's show, to attack Rock or WWF. Johnson mainly did the "if you don't like us, switch the channel" argument. They argued about worked numbers, with Johnson saying there are 22 million viewers every week. Bozell then said on Monday they were claiming 14 million. Johnson said it was 14 million voters and 22 million viewers, and Bozell didn't have his facts straight, so at least he was prepared with the worked numbers, which is something Bozell should have known off the top of his head at this stage of the game. That whole numbers argument was a waste of time on both sides because Rock was distorting the truth and Bozell had no clue of the truth. Bozell then brought up more than 30 sponsors had pulled out of SmackDown. Johnson claimed that Bozell didn't have his facts straight here, and that while some sponsors had pulled out, but that some that left had come back, without naming any. Johnson lost points for resorting to name-calling, which Bozell didn't. But Bozell didn't come unprepared. Really, they both won because they got CNN exposure. Keep these projections ready for next spring. NBC is promising broadcasters and advertisers that the XFL games on NBC will average a 5.5 rating for the season, that the games on UPN will average a 3.0, and the games on TNN will average a 2.5. Vince McMahon, in an interview with Pro Wrestling Torch, admitted the figures quoted all week were done through counting the same viewers multiple times, but even stated that an estimate of 10 million viewers was being generous. What percentage of people that would be considered serious wrestling fans don't watch Raw? Maybe 15%, being generous. Any number over 5.5 to 6 million for the number of voters that WWF reaches during a given week is probably a generous estimate. Johnson, who actually just registered to vote this past week, which was something several media outlets noted and made fun of him for, since he was encouraging people to register, at a WWF-sponsored MTV Get Out the Youth Vote rally, addressed Bozell without saying his name, saying if they're truly upset with it, lighten up. The violence in our show is very slapstick. There are no guns, well, except for a time or two with Austin. There are no knives, except maybe a time or two. There are no axes. Didn't Undertaker cut Mideon's chest open with one during the Russo days? Nobody gets killed. Nobody gets raped. Terry Runnels with Brian Pillman? Steel chairs and garbage cans are allowed, but everyone lives for another day. Overall, the Republicans were criticized in many circles over the next few days for having Johnson speak at the convention, given what the content is of wrestling shows, while Bozell also was under his share of criticism from some media outlets saying he should lighten up on wrestling. Jesse Ventura was on Meet the Press complaining about the Republicans inviting Johnson when so many of the Republicans were highly critical of him when he did SummerSlam last year. I guess whatever distinction there was between politics and wrestling will narrow greatly between now and November. Dave Heckner, Earl's twin brother who works as a road agent, suffered a mild heart attack on August 7th and at press time was at University Hospital in Newark, New Jersey, recovering. SummerSlam is officially headlined by a three-way with Rock vs. Triple H vs. Angle for the title and Benoit vs. Jericho. Probably also Undertaker and Kane vs. Show and someone, most likely Shane, maybe Edge and Christian both, and Venus vs. Guerrero for the IC Raw from August 7th in Madison Square Garden opened with Rock challenging Benoit to a title match. Shane insisted it be a no DQ. Angle asked to be named number one contender. They continued on the Stephanie, Angle and Triple H soap opera, with Joe E. Legend passing messages back and forth to make things hotter throughout the show. Rikishi beat X-Pac via DQ when Road Dogg interfered. They teased a future split as Dogg was laughing when X-Pac got the stink face. Dudley's beat RTC, Buchanan and Goodfather, via DQ when Richards interfered. It was hilarious listening to Ross talking about the hoes standing up for their principles. I guess if nothing else, WWF has the most principles hoes in the world. RTC laid out the Dudleys, and then finally Goodfather powerbombed the brunette, I think her name is Lisa, the blonde is Frosty Moore, through a table. Between that the end of Raw and Judy Bagwell and Tori Wilson taking punches, it was violence against women night on wrestling. The powerbomb was edited off Canadian TV. It started as Too Cool and Guerrero versus Venus and Test and Albert. Right away Guerrero was pile-driven on the floor by Venus. Chyna took his place. Finish saw Guerrero interfere and frog splash Venus so Chyna could score the pin. After a bunch of vignettes leading to this with Triple H not wanting to talk with Stephanie came out explaining she and Angle were just friends and apologized and admitted she was wrong and was jealous of Trish. Stephanie still can't act. Fans didn't want Triple H to forgive her, but they hugged and kissed while the fans booed. Stephanie said her last request was for Triple H to shake Angle's hand. Angle came out. Foley came out and ordered and said since both wanted to get the title shot at SummerSlam, Triple H also asked Foley for the shot that they could wrestle later in the show. Rock pinned Benoit in 8-10 of a really good match. Shane interfered regularly, including once pulling ref Tim White out. Benoit got a near fall with a diving headbutt and put on the crossface. Jericho ran in and gave Benoit the triple bomb on a chair and ran Shane off, allowing Rock to score a pin with the rock bottom. Taz came out and exactly 18 years to the day, and reprising the angle is probably no coincidence, but I'm sure nobody knew it was August 7, 1982 when it was done. Most famously, Taz started bullying Jim Ross. Taz tried in the ring to get the New York fans to boo him since he got some cheers saying he's from New York. They really didn't boo him. He went to the announcer's desk and started bad-mouthing Ross, finally knocking his cowboy hat off. He goaded Ross into slapping him. There was a very subtle Bell's palsy remark that probably could have been done without since the angle would have been just as good without it. Taz dared Ross to slap him again, but as Ross stood there and decided, Lawler punched Taz. The setup and timing made it an awesome angle since people didn't see it coming. The 1982 angle had Taz as Don Muraco, Ross of course was Gordon Solie, and Lawler was Roddy Piper. And for history, both Piper and Muraco were soon out of the territory, so they really got no sustained business from the angle. Matt Hardy and Acolytes beat Edge and Christian and Show via DQ when Show hit Acolytes with a chair and powerbombed Matt. Undertaker returned and brawled with Show, including throwing him off the stage onto a very protected table. Jericho was thrown into the main event with Angle and Triple H. After all this time, the crowd was pretty dead since Triple H and Angle were kept apart. Although it hurt this as a match, it was the right thing for business. Jericho worked real well, but the fans wanted Angle versus Triple H so bad they didn't want to see him. Finally, both guys did a double back superplex on Jericho and both pinned him simultaneously to both win. Finish was totally flat live, but I guess it had to be done like that for storyline. To try and end the show hot, Rock came out and gave the rock bottom to Triple H, Angle and finally Stephanie. SmackDown tapings on August 8 from the Continental Airlines Arena. Joe had a TV match against Malenko but was rolled up on SmackDown. Hardys beat RTC thanks to Lita interfering. Kaientai said they hired the APA for protection, but the check bounced and APA destroyed them. For SmackDown, Foley was out with Angle and Shane. Angle said to restore the title to the credibility it had in the days of Bruno Sammartino, that he should get the shot. Triple H and Stephanie came out. Stephanie said due to a back injury suffered when Rock gave her the rock bottom, she's injured and won't be able to defend the title. Foley announced a three-way for the title. Benoit and Venus beat Guerrero and Jericho when Benoit pinned Guerrero with a diving headbutt. Jericho put Benoit in the walls after. Albert and Venus beat up Guerrero and Chyna. Jericho put the walls on Shane as well, but when he did, Benoit put him in the crossface. Rikishi pinned X-Pac with the Banzai. Saturn and Terry beat Snow and Cat when Terry got head and hit Snow with a terrible-looking shot, and Saturn used Snow's Northern Lights bomb on him. Cat speared Terry after. Saturn and Snow are supposed to do a program over the European title. Dudleys beat Edge and Christian via DQ in a title match when Edge hit Bubba with a chair. As Inc. left, Hardys came out and threw them in the ring. Devon got a table and Hardys got two ladders. Matt and Jeff came off each ladder onto Edge, Matt a leg drop and Jeff a splash. Bubba power bombed Christian off the middle ropes through a table. Earlier in the show they did several vignettes with Inc. and the cast of the movie Highlander, which Adam Copeland is in, and they are advertising heavily on WWF programming since he's featured prominently in the TV commercial. The gist of the vignettes is Inc. are never shutting up about beating Dudleys and Hardys at WrestleMania, which may indicate a three-way at SummerSlam, and boring them, and all they want to do is meet The Rock. Taz and Lawler argued. Taz hit Lawler with a headset and Lawler juiced. Lawler got up and attacked Taz and they brawled in the ring with Lawler getting the better of it before they were pulled apart. RTC beat Too Cool when Buchanan hit the scissors kick on Scotty. Joe told Angle that all the boys were saying Triple H was going to double-cross him in the main event against Undertaker and Rock. Blackman pinned Albert to keep the hardcore title. Venus attacked Blackman and they doubled on him until Albert laid Blackman out with his finisher. Joe told Triple H that he heard Shane was going to double-cross him in the main event so Angle can get the title shot. They did a hospital interview with Elisa who was put through the table. In the main event, all was going well until Angle dropped an elbow, Rock moved, and it hit Triple H. Triple H walked out. Stephanie tried to talk him out of it but he left. Angle was left with both of them. Undertaker then pinned Angle after the last ride. Undertaker grabbed Stephanie and Triple H came out, but Rock once again gave him a rock bottom. Undertaker choke-slammed him and Rock gave him a people's elbow. Not sure how much of that will air on TV. SmackDown on August 3rd was mainly built around Stephanie, Triple H and Angle's storyline. Foley ordered them in the six-man with Stephanie and Triple H arguing throughout the show in some brilliantly written sketches, and even well acted by Triple H. It ended up in a match where Triple H, through pedigreeing Lita, gave Stephanie the win, but Triple H was brawling on the ramp with Devon Dudley. So Angle and Stephanie were hugging each other with Triple H getting jealous as the show ended. There is a real lesson to be learned about slowly pacing a feud so that the people want it before you get to it, because I've got a feeling when they finally pull the trigger on this, it'll mean big money. Nora Greenwald, who worked as Mona in WCW before recently being let go, has agreed to terms to start and is expected to sign in the next week or two. She's 22, and with her gymnastics ability, has a good athletic base and has a pretty face. It's a different fit. If anyone cared about the women's division as wrestlers, a pretty woman who is a good athlete and has potential to be a good worker would sound like a good investment. It's just that the current fan base sees women on the show as nothing more than Tanda. Stephanie notwithstanding, Greenwald isn't surgically redone enough to go along with being implanted enough to fit the current standards, although I suppose that could also change if necessary. It is easier at 22 to get that look, although it won't be easy for her with her heavier than today's model-sized lower body genetics, and maintain it than the women in their mid-30s under contract, who have to go to the Hollywood extreme Terry Boatwright measures plus, because Hollywood leading ladies in their mid-30s rarely do bikini shoots and have the luxury of body doubles if necessary. They do to maintain it. Then again, you can do almost anything with creative storylines because Stephanie doesn't fit the pattern of most of the other women, never gets her clothes torn off nor is there a demand to see them torn off, and with storylines, she's the most over of all of them anyway. If they were to re-educate the audience to women's wrestling as a craft as opposed to an excuse for clothes tearing, that would require the women to be as good or better workers than the men for it to work, and there just isn't anyone, let alone a crew of them, who can pull that off either. Foley is now working on a third book, which would be a collection of road stories, as well as addressing topics that he never addressed in the first one. A progress report should come out on Austin this week. At press time, there are no plans for him to be involved in SummerSlam in any way, although it's also said not to be ruled out completely either. Right now the belief is that Austin may never return as a full-time worker, but may be able to work smart enough and promo good enough to be effective with a toned-down style on big shows. But again, until the reports on his condition all come back, it's all speculation. Bob Holly will start rehab in a few weeks. Terry Tory is up to rehab 3 times per week. Dr. James Andrews reported to the WWF that she should have complete strength and flexibility back in the shoulder when she returns. Big Show was sent to Louisville for additional training before being put back in the ring on a full-time basis. Since he was there, he made a surprise appearance on the OVW show on August 4th at the Louisville Gardens. Nelson Frazier Jr. Viscera is working Memphis. He's cleared to return after his shoulder injury, but they have nothing as yet scripted for him. There is a very tentative August 28th debut date set for Steve Regal. Regal and Bruce Pritchard will be scouting wrestlers soon at the UPW shows in Southern California. Triple H has been wrapping his arm because of a badly bruised bicep. There was fear of the bruise becoming calcified, which would have forced surgery that would have kept him out of action, but they did x-rays on August 1st in Birmingham which showed it wasn't healing. In a dark match at the August 8th tapings, Joey Abs was no longer wearing the sweater vest, so they may be giving him a new gimmick. A retrospective on the WWF's legal problems from the early 1990s is in an Irv Mushnick article in the online magazine The Position. Although there have been reports to the contrary, as of this past week there have been no negotiations involving Curt Hennig coming in. The video of the NBA Finals bounced WWF off the #1 spot in the Rec Sports video charts for the first time seemingly in years. WWF has spots 2 through 4 with Rock, the People's Champ, Eve of Destruction and Rock, Know Your Role before the 2000 Stanley Cup video placed 5th. WWF had 13 of the top 20. ICP's Juggalo Championship Wrestling tape was number 9 and XPW was number 13, and again nothing from WCW on the list. Scott Levy will be coming in as Raven, but they'll start the character up from scratch and treat it as a new character. There was some advertising out that listed Austin as appearing on August 21st in Lafayette, Louisiana for Raw, but we're told it was mistaken and that he's not going to appear at that show. Chyna on TV this week had dropped a lot of weight, no doubt because she was doing a Playboy shoot. Ratings for the weekend of July 29th to 30th in the UK Raw did in 0.40, making it the top-rated show on Sky Sports 1. SmackDown was the third highest at 0.29. Superstars and Livewire were at 0.05. Nitro was the most watched show on TNT at 0.07 and Thunder was second at 0.04. SmackDown tapings on August 1st in Birmingham, Alabama drew a sellout 13,009 paying $381,767. House show August 5th in Cleveland drew 11,475 paying $342,657. House show August 6th in Washington, D.C. at the MCI Center drew a nearly full house of 17,355 paying $526,262. Raw on August 7th in Madison Square Garden drew a sellout 13,236 paying $407,870. It was announced on TV as the 14th consecutive MSG sellout. On the last show on June 24th, it was also announced on TV as the 14th consecutive sellout. This show was actually the 12th. Arena merchandise for the past week was an additional $429,983 or $7.81 per head. In Cleveland, the main matches saw Kane pin Benoit with a choke slam and Rock pin Triple H to keep the title. In that match, Benoit interfered hitting Rock with a chair and Earl Hebner made the count and Triple H was announced as winner and new champion. Tim White came out and told Hebner what happened. After Triple H decked White, Rock gave Triple H the rock bottom and Hebner counted that pin as well. In Washington, D.C., they changed the Kane-Benoit finish to a DQ with Show and Angle, who were off Cleveland, doing run-ins. The Rock vs. Triple H main event was in a cage, and they did a similar finish where Benoit slammed the cage door on Rock and Triple H scored the win. White again told Hebner, who restarted the match, and Rock scored the rock bottom. The Reader's Pages. Hall of Fame. I've been thinking about this year's candidates and who I thought should be inducted. Steve Austin, without question the biggest drawing card the WWF had since the glory days of Hulk Hogan. He was the most responsible for turning around the WWF. His ring work in his prime was excellent to even fantastic. Steve Austin vs. Bret Hart at WrestleMania 13. Of all the candidates this year, I think he's got to be the easiest choice, similar to Jushin Liger last year. I doubt he'll receive 90% of the vote that Liger did, because that's unheard of, but I think he'll get the 60% he needs easily. Shawn Michaels, to me, this is an easy pick, although I'm not sure if he'll get in. I thought for sure he'd get in last year and he came 1 vote shy. I still think he's the greatest performer of our generation, and longevity aside, his ring work was good enough to warrant entry. Chris Benoit, pound for pound perhaps the best wrestler in the world and definitely in North America. No wrestler works harder at improving himself and the quality of his matches. His ability to get good matches out of horrible workers speaks volumes. Someone with a passion and love for the business he's excelled in. Mick Foley. Nobody had as much heart as this man had to get to the top. A truly great story, combined with an incredible work etch that got him to where he is today. He was such a unique figure in an industry filled with selfish, only out for themselves type of people. If nothing else, his fantastic interview before his final match against Helmsley sealed the deal for me, although it was a shame he came back. But in the end, being able to support your family after putting your body through hell for 15 years isn't an offer that a normal person would turn down. The most notable exception to the list is Shinya Hashimoto. I think the last year or so has really dropped his stock in my mind, although he was a great worker who drew huge money at one point. Hopefully politics won't play a major role, but that's like hoping a Viscera match will be good. Marcel Molina. My choices for the Hall of Fame. Steve Austin, relatively short period on top due to injury but a phenomenal draw to the point where a few second appearance on a pay-per-view can pop a buy rate. Great worker, too. Mick Foley changed our perception of what a pro wrestler could be. Even though injured, could still have a great run of matches this year against Triple H. Freebirds, innovators of so many things in tag team wrestling. Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy at least were also top workers, and Hayes was one of the best interviews ever. Shinya Hashimoto, great worker with a long period of time on top. Headlined some of the biggest gates ever. Akira Hokuto, for about a year or so, she was the best worker around, male or female. She was responsible for much of AJW's success in the early 90s. I rarely saw her have a bad match, and her intensity in the ring was awesome. Bull Nakano, she bridged the gap for AJW and was the top heel for a long period of time. Very good worker. She took the ball from Dump Matsumoto and ran with it. Name withheld because on the selection committee. Here are my picks: Steve Austin, Mick Foley, Shinya Hashimoto, Fabulous Moolah, and Wilbur Snyder. On Austin and Foley, I feel longevity is not part of wrestling in the year 2000. Austin was at the forefront of a major turnaround in the business. He was an excellent worker until getting injured, and simply put, made a huge difference in the business. Foley, while not quite the headliner Austin was, helped bring about changes in the in-ring product, not all for the good, and he certainly sacrificed his body. In both cases, they did what was required of them as wrestlers to be very special, and both had very special charisma. Hashimoto is my pick simply based on all the huge crowds he's drawn, and he still has some mileage left apparently. Moolah was women's wrestling in the United States for nearly 3 decades, and she trained some good performers too. Snyder is too long forgotten and was one of the biggest stars of the 50s. As for the ones I didn't pick, I could make a little argument for Bob Backlund. It wasn't his fault that they promoted that type of babyface at that time any more than it was Austin's fault they did today. Chris Benoit may make it later. No matter how you cut it, he's never been the main event wrestler that drew big money. I probably should vote for people like Hokuto and Nakano, but I just don't know enough about them personally. Shawn Michaels will never get a vote in my lifetime. Being in the Hall of Fame means being a professional. That means when you get a title, you drop it in classic matches. I'd love to vote for Dick Murdoch, but like Benoit, but in a completely different way, he was usually never the man in a territory. Jimmy Snuka may have a slight edge on Murdoch, but again, he usually wasn't the man, and one great move shouldn't make a career. Undertaker as a gimmick, yes, but Mark Calloway as the Undertaker, no. Eric Bischoff? Haha. One lucky idea. One good run. One set of deep pockets to use. Promoters do need longevity to make it. Jesse Ventura. Because he was elected governor? Name withheld because on the selections committee. My picks. Steve Austin, incredible draw. Helped turn WWF business around. Remained good worker despite physical limitations. Chris Benoit, tremendous wrestler in various styles. Probably the best worker alive today. Mick Foley influenced generation of backyard wrestlers who will be stars of tomorrow. Great draw. Very good worker. Best-selling author. Shawn Michaels influenced a generation of young, small guys. Helped begin the WWF turnaround in the late 90s. Awesome worker. Dick Murdoch influenced a generation of tough guy brawlers. Close but no cigar. Lou Albano, legendary fool. Jesse Ventura worked an entire nation. Fabulous Moolah worked people into thinking she deserved to be nominated for the Hall of Fame. Bob Backlund ran perhaps the most foolish campaign in political history. Carlos Colon, legendary bleeder. Name withheld because on the selections committee. Steroids. This is in response to John McMullen's letter concerning steroid use in the NFL. In 6 years of covering 3 different teams on a daily basis, the Cincinnati Bengals, the Denver Broncos, and now the Miami Dolphins, I've yet to see overt signs of steroid abuse. That isn't to say I'm naive enough to believe there is absolutely zero abuse. Players can find all sorts of ways to mask anything, and I don't think any test is foolproof. But I do believe the NFL's testing program has greatly curtailed the problems from the 70s and 80s that McMullen seems to base his letter on. When discussing the size of NFL offensive linemen in his letter, he wrote, "For Mervis to believe this many men in America have the genetic makeup to reach 300 pounds and bench press in excess of 400 to 500 pounds is comical and shows a basic lack of understanding of the human body and weightlifting. Please." Each NFL team carries an average of 9 offensive linemen on their regular season roster, plus maybe 1 on the developmental squad. Multiply that figure by 31 teams and we're at 310 players. Toss in another 300 or so NFL hopefuls, and that number hits 600. In a country of 250 million people, Is it that hard to find people large enough, 6'2" or taller, and heavy enough to play on the line? I hope this gives some perspective on bench pressing and NFL players. Todd Wade, the Dolphins' second-round pick in this year's draft, set the University of Mississippi bench press record last year at 420 pounds. That puts him as one of the strongest players on the Dolphins' line. But the focus of NFL strength programs isn't solely on bench pressing. There is large amount of leg work and exercises like power cleans that are useful for building stronger football players, not bodybuilders. McMullen wrote about a 1993 drug bust where enough steroids were found to supply 2 NFL teams. Is there any proof the drugs were headed there? My whole point of the letter is I don't believe the NFL should be lumped in with pro wrestling when it comes to steroid abuse. The abuses in pro wrestling are much more blatant and severe, although the structures of the physiques have changed since the mid-80s when steroids changed the face of wrestling forever. Alex Merves. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,